Hello, and a very warm welcome to Sleep Tales. Thank you for joining me tonight. I am so glad you are here, ready to drift away into a peaceful story. Before we begin our journey, if you enjoy these tales, please consider subscribing to the channel and perhaps leaving a like on this video. It helps so much. I would also love to see where you are listening from tonight, so feel free to leave a comment below with your city or country. It's always wonderful to see how far our stories travel. Now, find a comfortable position. Let your body feel heavy and relaxed. Close your eyes and let your breath slow down. Let the sounds of your world fade away and allow my voice to be your guide. Let's begin. Faye was an architect of the cosmos, a name spoken with a sense of wonder in the star lanes and the gravity-bound cities of a dozen worlds. She was not just famous, she was a legend, a builder of things that hung in the silent velvet blackness between planets. Her work was not of concrete and steel, but of starlight and silence. She possessed a rare and profound skill, an intuition that allowed her to weave the very light of distant suns into solid forms. She could feel the subtle pull of moons in her bones, and she built structures that moved in harmony with these invisible tides, breathing with the slow rhythm of the universe. Her buildings did not fight against the cosmos. They were a part of it, as natural as a nebula or a newly formed star. Her life was a constellation of impossible achievements. She had once directed a team that spun a web of whispering galleries within the shimmering rings of Saturn. Structures so fine they were nearly invisible, yet they could carry a whispered secret from one edge of the rings to the other, a journey of thousands of miles. These galleries were made of solidified sound waves, a technology she herself had pioneered, making them echo with the faint, beautiful music of the ice particles that made up the rings themselves. She had designed and built solar observatories that danced within the fiery corona of a blue giant, their shields shimmering like the scales of a dragon as they withstood the unimaginable heat. Inside, scientists could watch the birth of solar flares in perfect safety, seeing the raw power of a star up close. On Mars, she had constructed the Great Library of Olympus Mons, a place of silent learning carved into the ruddy rock of the giant volcano. Its ceilings were made of polished crystal, angled perfectly to capture the light of the twin moons, Phobos and Deimos, bathing the endless rows of data crystals in a soft, ethereal glow. Her materials were as extraordinary as her designs. She favored light-spun silk, a fabric woven from photons that could be made as strong as any metal, but was as light as a thought. It shimmered with all the colors of a captured dawn. From the hearts of fallen meteors, she harvested a special kind of iron, an alloy forged in the chaos of cosmic collisions. This meteor iron was incredibly dense and strong, and it hummed with a faint, residual energy from its long journey through space. She used it for the foundations of her buildings, anchoring them to asteroids or the bedrock of fledgling planets. Her creations were marvels of engineering and art, perfect structures in a perfect, silent space. Yet, within Faye, a quiet sadness had begun to grow, a feeling as vast and empty as the void between galaxies. She was tired. She was tired of the grand scale, the endless silence, the cold, hard perfection of it all. The stars, once her inspiration, now seemed like cold, indifferent diamonds scattered on black velvet. The silence, once a canvas for her creativity, now felt like a crushing weight. She found herself yearning for the simple, imperfect things she had only ever read about or seen in simulations. She missed a sun that was just a sun, a single warm star in a blue sky, not a terrifying blue giant or a distant cold dwarf. She longed for the simple, predictable cycle of a regular day and night, the rising and setting of a single sun, a rhythm her body had never known. She dreamed of the smell of rain on dry earth, a scent that could not exist in the sterile, recycled air of her habitats. She craved the feeling of solid ground beneath her feet, not the magnetized plates of a space station or the low-gravity surface of a moon. She wanted soil, grass, and the simple, unyielding reality of a world that had been shaped by wind and water, not by tools and ambition. More than anything, she wanted peace, a quiet, simple peace that could not be found in the magnificent, echoing emptiness of her own creations. She wanted to build something small, something for herself, something that would not be remembered for centuries, but would simply be a home. Chapter 1: The Last Masterpiece and the Journey Home. Faye stood perfectly still, a lone, silent figure suspended in the heart of her own creation. She was in the central viewing chamber of the Kepler Intergalactic Observatory, a space that was less a room and more a bubble of perfect, uninterrupted vision. The chamber was a perfect sphere, and its walls were not walls at all, but a single, seamless shell of flawless diamond glass, the strongest and most transparent material ever conceived. It had taken the focused energy of a small star for a full year to synthesize a pane of this size. There were no visible instruments here, no blinking lights, no humming consoles. The observatory was designed to be a place of pure observation, a silent eye staring into the deepest, darkest corners of the universe. All the complex machinery, the graviton lenses, the temporal sensors, the vast data storage units were hidden deep within the observatory's superstructure, leaving this central chamber as a sanctuary of silence and sight. Faye's feet were lightly magnetized to the floor, giving her the feeling of standing, though the concept of up or down had no real meaning here. In one direction, filling half of her view, was the majestic, sprawling spiral of the Milky Way galaxy. It was a sight she knew intimately, a familiar river of light, dust, and 100 billion stars. It was home. In the other direction, an equally magnificent but somehow more imposing sight was the Andromeda Galaxy. It was larger, brighter, and it hung in the blackness like a cosmic ghost, its own spiral arms reaching out across the void. The observatory was her life's ultimate achievement, her final and most profound statement as an architect. It was positioned with impossible precision in a place of perfect gravitational balance between the two galaxies, a place where it would remain, motionless and undisturbed, for eons. Its purpose was singular and patient: to watch the slow, inevitable dance of these two colossal star systems as they moved toward each other, destined to merge in a gentle, cosmic collision billions of years in the future. It was a monument to foresight, a testament to a species that thought not in terms of years or centuries, but in geological and astronomical time. In her gloved hand, she held the final component. It was a small, intricately carved crystal, no larger than her thumb. It looked simple, almost like a piece of jewelry, but it was the heart of the entire observatory. It was a quantum entanglement key, designed to align the trillions of microscopic sensors embedded in the observatory's outer shell, focusing them as one. Without this final piece, the Kepler Observatory was just a magnificent, empty shell. With it, it would become the most powerful eye in the history of the universe. She pushed off from the floor with a gentle movement, her body drifting in the zero gravity with a practiced ease. She had spent more of her life in weightlessness than she had on the solid ground of any planet. Her muscles were long and lean, adapted to a life without the constant pull of a home world. She floated toward the exact center of the spherical chamber, where a small, almost invisible pedestal awaited. The pedestal was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air, a localized distortion of space-time designed to hold the key. As she approached, a small indentation glowed with a soft, white light. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the final steps in a project that had consumed 20 years of her life. She thought of the thousands of engineers, physicists, and laborers who had worked under her direction. She thought of the political battles she had fought to secure the funding, the endless meetings, the sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible equations. She remembered the dangers, the construction ships lost to micrometeoroid impacts, the delicate process of transporting the diamond glass across star systems. All of it, all the work, all the sacrifice, had led to this single, quiet moment. She reached the pedestal and positioned the crystal over the glowing indentation. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was even. But inside, in the quiet spaces of her heart, she felt nothing. There was no surge of pride, no thrill of accomplishment. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness that seemed to rival the void outside the chamber walls. The silence of space was not a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, crushing absence of everything. It was a silence that swallowed sound, light, and warmth. For years, she had found a strange comfort in it, a blank canvas upon which she could project her grand designs. But now, it felt like a tomb. The two galaxies, beautiful and majestic as they were, seemed cold and utterly indifferent. They were giant, unthinking machines of gas and gravity, their slow dance meaningless. They were not alive. They did not care that she was here, watching them. They did not care about the hopes and dreams of the tiny, fleeting creatures who had built this place to observe them. She looked at her own reflection, a faint, ghost-like image on the surface of the diamond glass. A small, human figure adrift in an ocean of stars. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. Her eyes, once filled with a fiery passion for the cosmos, were now just tired. Her face, known across the galaxy, was just a mask. She had built wonders, but she had forgotten how to live. With a final, soft click, she pressed the crystal into its housing. A wave of energy, invisible to the naked eye, pulsed outward from the center of the chamber. On a small, simple band on her wrist, a single line of text appeared. Calibration complete. All systems online. The observatory was awake. Its long watch had begun. And in that moment of ultimate triumph, Faye felt the full, crushing weight of her loneliness. This masterpiece, this legacy that would outlive her by millions of years, was a prison of her own making. It was the final, perfect expression of a life spent reaching for the stars, only to find that they were cold, empty, and very, very far away. A decision, one that had been growing in the back of her mind for years, now bloomed into full, undeniable certainty. It was not a choice made out of anger or frustration, but out of a deep and profound weariness. She was done. She floated back to the wall of the chamber, her movements now having a new sense of purpose, a new direction. She activated a small, hidden communication panel. It glowed to life, showing her a list of priority channels, news feeds, and official government contacts. She ignored them all. She opened a single universal broadcast channel, one that would send her message to every corner of human-occupied space. Her fingers hovered over the input screen. She could have written a long, eloquent speech, explaining her retirement, her philosophy, her reasons for leaving. She could have thanked her teams, her patrons, her admirers. But that was the old Faye, the public figure, the legend. The real Faye, the tired woman who just wanted to go home, had no need for so many words. She typed a short, simple message, 5 words. "I am going home." Then she hit send. She did not wait for the inevitable flood of replies. She did not look at the frantic alerts and priority messages that began to flash on the screen almost instantly. She simply deactivated the panel, plunging the chamber back into its pure, unbroken view of the cosmos. She turned her back on the 2 galaxies, on her masterpiece, on her entire life's work, and pushed off toward the exit corridor. She did not look back. Her personal ship, the Wanderer, was a small, unassuming vessel docked at a discreet port on the observatory's outer ring. It was built for function, not for show. A simple, reliable craft designed for long, solitary journeys. As she moved through the silent, empty corridors of the observatory, the automated systems tracked her progress. Soft lights came on ahead of her and faded behind her. A calm, synthesized voice announced her movements. Architect Faye proceeding to Docking Bay 7. All systems normal. It was the voice of the building she had created, a voice that was both her servant and her keeper. It was a voice she never wanted to hear again. She reached the docking bay and cycled through the airlock. The Wanderer was waiting, its silver hull a stark contrast to the matte black of the observatory. She entered the cockpit and strapped herself into the pilot's chair. The ship's systems came online with a soft, familiar hum. It was a comforting sound, the sound of escape. With a few simple commands, she initiated the undocking sequence. Clamps retracted with a series of soft, metallic thuds. The docking tunnel pulled away. Her ship was now floating free, a tiny silver seed next to the colossal, diamond-like structure of the observatory. For a single, fleeting moment, she looked at it through the cockpit's main viewport. Her masterpiece, a silent, invisible ghost, already beginning its eternal vigil. She felt a brief, sharp pang of something, not regret, but perhaps a kind of distant, impersonal sadness, the way one might feel sad for a beautiful, caged animal. Then she turned her ship and engaged the engines. The Wanderer accelerated smoothly and silently, pulling away from the place between the galaxies, setting a course for a single, specific star in the outer arm of the Milky Way. The first part of the journey was through the intergalactic void. This was the true emptiness, the vast, dark ocean that separated the great islands of stars. Here, the view from the cockpit was an almost perfect, uniform black. The galaxies she had left behind shrank with agonizing slowness, becoming faint, misty patches of light. And then, eventually, they were indistinguishable from the other distant galaxies that were just faint smudges against the black. She was utterly, completely alone. For weeks, she traveled through this profound emptiness. She put the ship on autopilot and let her mind drift. She did not work. She did not design. She did not even think about the future. Instead, she spent her time accessing the ship's archives, delving into old, forgotten files from Earth. She watched historical videos of things she had never experienced. She watched waves crashing on a rocky shore, the water turning to white foam. She listened to the sound of wind rustling through a forest of tall trees. She watched videos of rain falling on a city street, the water creating shimmering reflections of the lights. She looked at pictures of things she had only ever seen in diagrams, a bumblebee on a flower, a cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight, a child building a castle in the sand. These simple, mundane images filled her with a powerful, aching sense of longing. This was what she had given up. This was what she was going back to find. She ate simple, reconstituted meals, but she read old recipes for real food, imagining the smells of baking bread, roasting meat, and fresh herbs. The sterile, recycled air of her ship began to feel suffocating. She dreamed of the smell of dirt after a rainstorm. After what felt like an eternity, the ship finally crossed the invisible boundary into her home galaxy, the Milky Way. The change was subtle at first, then dramatic. The utter blackness of the void was slowly replaced by a dusting of stars. At first, it was like a faint sprinkle of salt on a black tablecloth. Then, the sprinkle became a dense layer of sugar. Soon, she was sailing through a river of diamonds, a thick, glittering band of stars, gas, and dust that was the galactic plain. The silence in the cockpit was now contrasted by a view of overwhelming, chaotic beauty. She passed through vast, glowing nebulae, clouds of hydrogen gas where new stars were being born. They bloomed in the darkness like impossible, cosmic flowers, their colors a breathtaking palette of deep reds, vibrant pinks, and ethereal blues. She flew past binary star systems, two suns locked in a gravitational embrace, chasing each other's tails in a fiery, silent dance. She saw the glittering, tightly packed spheres of globular clusters, ancient families of 1,000,000 stars, so old they had witnessed the birth of the galaxy itself. For her entire life, these sights had been her inspiration, her muse. She had looked at a nebula and seen the arch of a grand cathedral. She had looked at a star cluster and seen the design for a chandelier in a celestial ballroom. Now, she saw them for what they were: beautiful, magnificent, and utterly alien. They were not for her, not anymore. They were just landmarks on her long journey home. She kept her course steady, ignoring the siren call of 1,000 unexplored worlds. Her destination was not some new, exciting frontier. Her destination was the past. Finally, after months of travel that had felt like a lifetime, she entered the familiar territory of her home system. The ship's navigation chart lit up with the names she had learned as a child. Jupiter appeared first, a colossal, striped giant with its swirling great red spot, a storm larger than any planet she had ever set foot on. She flew past Saturn, its magnificent rings shimmering in the light of the distant sun. She felt a brief, detached memory of her whispering galleries, a project from her youth, a work of delicate, playful beauty. It felt like it had been designed by a different person. Then came Mars, the red planet. Through the ship's telescope, she could just make out the faint, dark shape of Olympus Mons, the giant volcano where her great library stood, a silent monument to knowledge carved into the rock. She felt no pride, no connection to it. It was just a building, a beautiful, empty building. And then she saw it. Ahead of her, a small, spinning orb of breathtaking beauty. It was a swirl of brilliant white clouds, deep blue oceans, and patches of green and brown land. It was Earth. It was not a sterile, perfect sphere. It was messy, chaotic, and vibrantly, gloriously alive. Tears welled in Faye's eyes, the first she had shed in decades. The sight of her home, so small and fragile in the vastness of space, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The Wanderer began its final approach. The automated systems took over, guiding the ship into a stable orbit and then beginning the complex sequence for atmospheric entry. A low shudder ran through the ship as it hit the first, thin tendrils of the upper atmosphere. The view outside the cockpit began to change. The sharp, hard black of space softened into a deep indigo, then a royal blue, and then a bright, brilliant azure. The ship's heat shields began to glow, a fiery orange aura surrounding the vessel as it plunged deeper into the sky. The whistle of air rushing past the hull grew into a loud, powerful roar. She was no longer in the silent, frictionless void. She was in a world of substance, of friction, of weather. She was in a world that pushed back. She felt the pull of gravity grow stronger, a comforting, heavy weight settling on her limbs. She had programmed the landing coordinates long ago, selecting a remote, uninhabited location from a set of ancient topographical maps. It was a place with no name she knew, just a patch of green next to a body of blue. The ship broke through the final layer of clouds, and the ground rushed up to meet her. It was a landscape of rolling green hills, dotted with patches of dark forest. In the center of it all was a large, calm lake, its surface like a sheet of dark, polished glass, reflecting the blue sky and the white clouds perfectly. She took manual control for the final descent, guiding the ship away from the trees and toward a flat, open meadow near the water's edge. The landing was soft, the ship settling onto the grass with a gentle bump and a sigh of hydraulics. The engines whined down, and their powerful hum was replaced by a new kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of space. It was a silence that was filled with 1,000 tiny, living sounds. Faye sat in the pilot's chair for a long time, just listening. She could hear the gentle, rhythmic sound of water lapping against the shore. She could hear the rustle of a light breeze moving through the leaves of the trees. She could hear the chirping and singing of birds, a sound she had only ever heard on recordings, a complex, beautiful, and utterly natural music. With a trembling hand, she reached out and pressed the button to unseal the main hatch. The hatch hissed open, and the air of Earth flowed into the sterile, recycled atmosphere of her ship. It was the most incredible thing she had ever smelled. It was cool and damp, and it smelled of wet earth, of green growing things, of wildflowers and decaying leaves. It was the smell of life itself. She unstrapped herself from the chair and walked to the open hatch. She stood for a moment on the threshold, looking out at the green meadow, the blue lake, the ordinary, beautiful world that was waiting for her. Then she walked down the ramp and stepped onto the soft, damp grass. The ground was real. The sun was warm on her skin. The breeze stirred her hair. She was not a legend here. She was not an architect. She was just a woman, standing on the earth, under the sky. She was home. Chapter 2. A New Kind of Building. The first days on Earth were a lesson in forgotten feelings. Faye left the wanderer sealed in the meadow, a silent silver monument to a life she had left behind. Her initial explorations were small and cautious, tentative steps into a world that was overwhelmingly full of sensations. She walked the edge of the lake, her feet sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth near the water. In space, every surface was hard, unyielding, and precisely engineered. Here, the ground itself was alive. It was soft in some places, firm in others, and everywhere it was covered in a thick carpet of green grass, dotted with small, brightly colored wildflowers she could not name. She would kneel down and touch the petals of a small blue flower, marveling at its delicate texture, a softness that no light-spun silk could ever replicate. She would run her fingers over the rough, furrowed bark of a tree, feeling the history of its growth, the slow, patient record of seasons and storms. Everything had a texture, a temperature, a smell. The air itself was the most remarkable thing. It was not the flat, neutral, perfectly balanced air of a habitat, scrubbed clean of all impurities. The air here was a complex and ever-changing thing. In the morning, it was cool and heavy with mist, carrying the clean, green scent of the lake and the damp earth. In the afternoon, when the sun was high, the air grew warm and smelled of sun-baked grass and the faint, sweet perfume of the wildflowers. In the evening, as the air cooled again, a different scent would rise from the forest, a rich, loamy smell of decaying leaves and pine needles. Faye would simply stand for long periods, her eyes closed, just breathing. She was breathing in the world, letting its wild, untamed essence fill her lungs and quiet her mind. Her days took on a simple, natural rhythm. She woke when the sky began to lighten, not because an alarm told her to, but because the songs of the birds grew louder, a joyful, chaotic chorus that was impossible to ignore. She would eat the simple, packaged rations from her ship, but she ate them sitting on the grass, watching the sun rise over the hills, its light turning the surface of the lake from a dark, inky black to a shimmering sheet of gold. During the day, she walked. She had no destination, no goal other than to explore the small, quiet world she had chosen. She followed deer trails through the woods, her feet silent on the soft carpet of fallen leaves. She watched squirrels chase each other up the trunks of tall trees. She sat on sun-warmed rocks and watched the clouds drift across the sky, their shapes constantly shifting, forming and dissolving like dreams. In space, the view was static, a beautiful but unchanging vista of stars and nebulae. Here, the view was never the same from one moment to the next. The light changed, the wind moved the leaves, the water rippled, the clouds moved. It was a world in constant, gentle motion. In the evenings, she would watch the sun set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange, pink, and purple. And then came the stars. They were not the hard, brilliant diamonds she was used to seeing through the perfect clarity of a viewport. Here, they were softer, twinkling gently through the thin veil of the atmosphere. They seemed less like distant, cold suns and more like friendly, flickering candles in the dark. She was not their architect anymore. She was just a small creature, looking up at them in wonder, just like her most ancient ancestors had done. It was on one of her long, aimless walks that she found it. She had followed the shoreline of the lake further than she had before, around a gentle curve where a thick stand of old trees grew close to the water. Pushing through a curtain of low-hanging branches, she found herself in a small, hidden cove. And there, set back from the water, half swallowed by the green embrace of the forest, was a house. It was not a grand structure. It was a small, simple cottage, built of stone and wood, and it looked as if it had grown out of the earth itself. It was old, forgotten, and in a state of quiet decay, but it had a strength to it, a sense of patient endurance that her own perfect, sterile creations could never possess. The walls were made of large, rounded stones, the kind that were plentiful along the shore of the lake. They were a patchwork of grays, browns, and greens, and they were almost entirely covered in a thick green blanket of ivy. The ivy grew in a wild, untamed tangle, its leaves obscuring the shape of the windows and climbing all the way up to the roof. The roof itself was made of dark slate tiles, but many of them were missing, leaving dark, gaping holes. In some places, the roof sagged, giving the whole structure a tired, weary look, like an old man stooping his shoulders. A single stone chimney stood at one end, tall and straight, though a small tree had begun to grow out of the very top of it. There were 2 windows on the front of the house, their wooden frames weathered to a soft, silvery gray. Some of the glass panes were broken, leaving dark, empty eyes staring out at the lake. The front door was made of thick, heavy planks of wood, its original color long since peeled away by years of sun and rain. A wild rose bush had grown up beside the door, its thorny branches reaching across it as if to bar the way. Faye walked slowly toward the house, her footsteps silent on the soft grass. She felt a strange sense of reverence, as if she were approaching a sacred place. This was not a building designed by a computer, its every angle and material calculated for maximum efficiency. This was a house built by hand. She could see the marks of the tools on the wooden window frames. She could see the subtle variations in the mortar between the stones. She could feel the care and the effort that had gone into its construction so many years ago. It was a house that had a story. She reached the front wall and placed her hand on the stones. They were cool and rough to the touch, covered in a thin, velvety layer of moss. She could feel the solid, unyielding reality of the stone, its ancient weight and permanence. This was not an illusion of strength created by force fields and advanced alloys. This was the simple, honest strength of the earth itself. She walked the perimeter of the small house, her eyes taking in every detail of its slow, gentle decay. At the back, a small section of the stone wall had collapsed, leaving a jumble of rocks and a dark opening into the house's interior. A thick tangle of weeds and wildflowers grew out of the rubble. It was here that she found her way in. She climbed carefully over the fallen stones and stepped into the dim, quiet interior. The air inside was cool and still, and it smelled of damp earth, decaying wood, and a century of dust. Shafts of sunlight lanced down from the holes in the roof, illuminating swirling clouds of dust motes in the air. The inside of the house was just one large room. A huge fireplace, built of the same dark stone as the walls, dominated one end of the room. Its hearth was filled with a thick layer of old gray ash and a few pieces of rotted wood. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, warped and uneven in places, and covered in a thick layer of dust and fallen leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. There was no furniture, just the ghostly outlines in the dust where things had once stood. A rickety-looking wooden ladder led up to a small loft area, nestled under the sagging roof. Faye walked slowly to the center of the room, her boots making soft, muffled sounds on the dusty floor. She looked up at the ceiling, at the heavy, hand-hewn wooden beams that supported the roof. She could see the sky through the holes. She looked at the walls, at the places where the old plaster had crumbled away, revealing the rough stone beneath. She ran her hand along the cool, rough surface of the fireplace. This was a building that had been lived in. It had known warmth and laughter. It had sheltered people from storms. It had been a home. And in that moment, standing in the dusty, forgotten heart of the old stone house, Faye knew she had found her new project. This would be her masterpiece. Not a monument to the stars, but a simple, quiet shelter on the shore of a lake. The next day, she returned to the Wanderer. The ship's interior was clean, silent, and perfect. The air was sterile. The light was artificial. After just a few days on Earth, it already felt alien and wrong. She went to the storage compartment, a large room filled with the most advanced construction tools ever created. There were laser cutters that could slice through diamond, nanoassemblers that could build complex structures atom by atom, anti-gravity lifters that could move objects weighing hundreds of tons with a single touch. She looked at the gleaming, perfect tools that had been her companions for so long. They were tools for building in a vacuum, for shaping light and weaving energy. They were useless here. She could not use a laser cutter to mend a stone wall. She could not use a nanoassembler to plane a piece of wood. These tools were too powerful, too precise, too perfect. They had no place in the messy, imperfect world of stone, wood, and earth. She sealed the storage compartment, leaving the tools of her old life behind. She took only a few simple things from the ship: a supply of nutrient packs, a water purifier, a basic first aid kit, and a sleeping bag. Then she walked away from the silver ship and did not look back. She knew she needed new tools, simple tools, tools that were made for hands, not for computers. She had seen on her maps that there was a small town, a tiny dot on the map, about a day's walk from the lake. The next morning, she set out. The walk was long, but it was not difficult. She followed a small, overgrown track that led away from the lake and up into the hills. The air was fresh and cool, and the world was filled with the sounds of insects buzzing and birds singing. It was a long, quiet, and peaceful walk. The town was small, just a single street with a few dozen houses and a handful of shops. The buildings were old, made of wood and brick. People looked at her with curiosity. Her plain gray jumpsuit, the standard uniform for off-world travel, was unlike anything they had ever seen. But they were friendly, smiling and nodding as she passed. She found a shop that sold hardware. It was a dark, cluttered place that smelled of oil, sawdust, and metal. Tools hung from the walls and ceiling, and bins were filled with nails, screws, and bolts. An old man with a kind, wrinkled face stood behind a wooden counter. Faye did not speak. She had not spoken a single word aloud since she had sent her message from the observatory. She simply pointed at the thing she needed. She chose a heavy hammer with a smooth, worn wooden handle. She chose a saw, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. She picked out a trowel for working with mortar, a sturdy wooden ladder, a shovel, a bucket, and a crowbar. They were simple, heavy, and real. They were tools that had not changed much in hundreds of years. She paid for them with a small universal credit chip, a piece of technology that seemed impossibly advanced in this simple, quiet place. The old man looked at it with wonder, but he accepted it without question. Faye carried her new tools back to the lake, the weight of them a comforting, solid presence on her shoulders. Her work began the next morning. She did not start with a grand plan or a complex blueprint. Her new kind of building was not about planning. It was about doing. It was about slow, patient, and mindful work. Her first task was to free the house from the clutches of the forest. She started with the wild rose bush that guarded the front door. She used a small, sharp handsaw to carefully cut back the thorny branches, one by one. The work was slow and sometimes painful as the thorns scratched her hands. But with each branch she removed, she revealed more of the old wooden door. By the end of the first day, the door was free. She then turned her attention to the ivy that covered the walls. It was a thick, woody vine, its roots clinging tightly to the stone. She used the crowbar to pry the thickest vines away from the wall, and then she pulled, her muscles straining with the effort. Long, thick ropes of ivy came away, revealing the beautiful, moss-covered stones beneath. It was hard, physical work, the kind her body was not used to. At the end of each day, her muscles ached and her hands were sore. But it was a good kind of tired, a satisfying exhaustion that came from real, tangible effort. As she worked, she fell into a new rhythm, the rhythm of the earth. Her days were governed by the sun. She worked when it was light and rested when it was dark. Her clock was the changing light, the shifting shadows, the songs of the birds. She began to enjoy the simple sounds that surrounded her, the rhythmic scrape of her trowel as she cleared loose mortar from between the stones, the solid, satisfying thud of her hammer driving a nail into wood, the whisper of the saw as it cut through a plank. These sounds were a stark contrast to the perfect, engineered silence of her life in space. Here, every action had a sound, an echo, a presence. And woven through the sounds of her own work were the constant, gentle sounds of the world around her. The steady, hypnotic lapping of the lake, water against the shore. The sigh of the wind as it moved through the leaves of the tall trees. A sound that changed with the seasons, from a soft whisper in the summer to a mournful howl in the winter. And always, the birds. She began to recognize their different calls. The cheerful chirping of small birds in the morning, the lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead, the hoot of an owl in the deep twilight. These sounds became the soundtrack to her new life, a constant, comforting reminder that she was not alone. After clearing the walls, she began the slow, patient work of repair. She started with the collapsed section of the back wall. She carefully removed the fallen stones, cleaning them one by one and setting them aside. She cleared the rubble and dug a new, solid foundation. Then, she began to rebuild, stone by stone. She learned to mix mortar in a bucket, getting the feel for the right consistency of sand, cement, and water. It was an art, not a science. She would spread a thick layer of mortar with her trowel and then carefully place a stone, tapping it into place with the handle of her hammer. It was like solving a slow, three-dimensional puzzle, finding the right stone for each place, making sure everything was level and strong. It took her weeks to rebuild that single small section of wall. But when it was done, she stood back and looked at her work with a sense of pride that she had never felt, even when looking at the Kepler Observatory. This was her work. Her hands had built this. She had taken something broken and made it whole again. She moved on to the roof. This was more difficult and dangerous work. She used the ladder to climb up, carefully picking her way across the old, fragile slate tiles. She spent days just clearing away the debris, the fallen leaves, the dirt that had accumulated over the years, the small tree that had taken root in the chimney. She found a place in the nearby hills where the same dark slate had been quarried long ago. She carried the heavy, flat stones back to the house, one by one. Replacing the missing slates was a slow, meticulous process. She had to nail each one in place, making sure they overlapped perfectly to keep the rain out. She worked under the hot summer sun, the sweat dripping from her brow. She worked in the cool, crisp air of autumn, with the leaves of the surrounding forest turning to brilliant shades of red and gold. Slowly, patiently, the dark holes in the roof disappeared, replaced by a solid, unbroken expanse of dark gray stone. The house was now sealed against the weather. Next were the windows. She carefully removed the old, rotted frames. She found a tall, straight tree that had been felled by a storm, and from it she began to saw new planks. She had never worked with wood before, and her first attempts were clumsy and uneven. But she learned. She learned to feel the grain of the wood, to use a hand plane to smooth its surface until it was as soft as silk. She built new frames, her joints getting tighter and more precise with each one. She bought new panes of glass in the small town and learned how to set them in place with putty. When she installed the first new window, the change was remarkable. A clear, bright square of light now fell on the dusty floor, and for the first time, she had a perfect, unobstructed view of the lake from inside the house. She found a simple joy in the passing of the seasons, something she had never experienced in the climate-controlled, seasonless world of space. She felt the long, warm days of summer when the sun beat down on her back as she worked on the roof. She swam in the cool, refreshing water of the lake in the evenings. She watched the world turn a vibrant, explosive green. Then came autumn. The air grew crisp and cool. The leaves on the trees turned from green to a fiery palette of yellow, orange, and red. She spent her days working in a world of breathtaking color, a cool breeze rustling the dry leaves around her. She learned to enjoy the smell of wood smoke in the air. Winter came quietly, with the first gentle fall of snow. The world became quiet, muffled under a thick white blanket. The lake froze over, its surface a vast white sheet of ice. She spent the cold, short days working inside the house, sanding the floors, plastering the walls. She would work by the light of a lantern, the only sounds the scrape of her tools and the howl of the wind outside. She would sit by the fireplace, where she had finally managed to build a roaring fire, feeling its warmth seep into her bones, watching the flames dance and flicker. And then, just when it seemed the cold and the dark would last forever, came the spring. The snow melted. The ice on the lake broke up with a great cracking and groaning. The first green shoots began to push their way up through the cold earth. The birds returned, their songs filling the morning air once more. The world was waking up, being reborn, and Faye felt as if she were being reborn with it. She had never known this simple, powerful, and eternal rhythm. It was the rhythm of life itself, and she found a deep and profound happiness in simply being a part of it. One day, in the early spring, after the last of the snow had melted, she began to work on the small patch of ground in front of the house. She cleared away the weeds and the rocks, and with her shovel, she turned over the dark, rich earth. The soil was cool and crumbly in her hands, and it smelled of life and possibility. She made another trip to the town and came back with small paper packets of seeds. They were seeds for simple, hardy flowers, marigolds, zinnias, and cornflowers. She knelt in the soft earth and planted the tiny seeds, one by one, pushing them gently into the soil. It was a simple, hopeful act. She was no longer just fixing what was broken. She was starting something new. She was planting a garden. She was putting down roots. Her work was not done. The house was still rough, still unfinished. But it was no longer a forgotten ruin. It was a home in the making. And Faye, the famous architect of the stars, was no longer a legend. She was just a woman, covered in dust and dirt, her hands calloused, her face weathered by the sun and the wind. And for the first time in her life, she was truly, deeply, and peacefully happy. Chapter 3. The Rhythm of the Earth. The house was no longer a ruin. It was a shelter. The roof was whole, the walls were strong, and the windows held clear glass that let in the light and kept out the wind. Faye's work had shifted from large, heavy repairs to smaller, more detailed tasks. She spent a week sanding the wide wooden floorboards by hand. She would kneel for hours, a simple block of wood wrapped in rough paper in her hand, moving it back and forth, along the grain of the old wood. The work was slow and repetitive, a meditation in motion. A fine, pale dust filled the air, catching the sunlight in hazy beams. Her knees ached and her shoulders grew tired, but she found a deep satisfaction in the process. With each pass of the sandpaper, she was smoothing away the years of neglect, revealing the beautiful pale grain of the wood beneath the grime. She was not just sanding a floor, she was polishing a piece of history. When she was finally done, the floor was smooth and soft to the touch, and the whole room seemed brighter, lighter. She then turned her attention to the stone walls inside. She mixed plaster in her bucket, a simple recipe of lime, sand, and water, until it was a thick, smooth paste. Using her trowel, she began to apply it to the rough stone walls, filling the gaps, smoothing the surface. It was a messy, imperfect process. Her first attempts were lumpy and uneven. But she learned the feel of the plaster, the right pressure to apply, the right angle to hold the trowel. She worked her way around the room, section by section, and the dark, rough stone disappeared beneath a clean, white surface. The house was slowly transforming from a dark cave into a bright, welcoming space. Her life settled into a pattern, a simple and unchanging rhythm that was governed not by a clock, but by the sun and the seasons. This pattern became the foundation of her new existence, a quiet and steady beat that soothed the parts of her that had been frayed by the endless, silent pressure of space. Each day began in the same way. She would wake naturally, without the need for an alarm. The first hint of light would begin to seep into the room, a soft, gray glow that slowly pushed back the darkness. At the same time, the first bird would begin to sing, a single, clear, hopeful note in the pre-dawn quiet. Soon, another would join in, and then another, until the air was filled with a complex and beautiful symphony. This was her morning call, the gentle announcement that the world was waking up. She would rise from her sleeping bag on the smooth wooden floor, stretch her tired muscles, and walk to the new window that faced the lake. This was her morning ritual, the most important part of her day. She would stand there, perfectly still, and watch the sun rise. Every single morning, she watched, and every single morning it was different. Some days, a thick white mist lay over the lake, so dense that she could not see the water at all. The world was a sea of soft gray clouds, and the sun would first appear as a faint, diffuse glow behind the mist, a promise of light rather than the light itself. Then, as the sun climbed higher, it would begin to burn through the fog, creating golden pathways and revealing dark, ghost-like shapes of the trees on the far shore. Other mornings, the sky was perfectly clear, a deep, dark blue at the horizon that slowly faded to a soft, pale yellow. The sun would then appear as a brilliant, fiery orange sliver, setting the edge of the far hills on fire. Its light would spill across the surface of the lake, which would be as still and dark as polished obsidian, creating a shimmering golden road that seemed to lead directly to her door. She watched the colors change, from deep purples and oranges to soft pinks and golds, until finally the sun was fully risen, a bright white disk in a pale blue sky, and the day had officially begun. This simple, daily act of watching the sunrise grounded her. It connected her to the planet in a profound way. It was a reminder that she was part of a world that was constantly turning, constantly moving, constantly being reborn in light. After the sunrise, she would go down to the water's edge. The air would be cool and clean. She would splash the cold lake water on her face, the shock of it waking her up completely. She would fill her bottle with water, which she would later purify. Then she would take a walk, following the same path along the shoreline every morning. She came to know this small stretch of land intimately. She knew which rocks were slippery with green moss. She knew where the wild mint grew, and she would crush a leaf between her fingers, breathing in its sharp, clean scent. She knew which trees the squirrels favored, and she would often see them, their bushy tails twitching as they chased each other up the high branches. She learned to read the signs of the other animals that shared this place with her. She would see the delicate, cloven hoof prints of deer in the soft mud at the water's edge. Sometimes she would find the remains of a fish on a flat rock, the leavings of an otter's morning meal. These small discoveries filled her with a quiet sense of wonder. She was not alone here. She was a guest in a world that was already full of life. Her days were spent in simple, purposeful labor. She continued her work on the house, but now that the major repairs were done, her tasks were smaller. She built simple furniture from the wood she salvaged from the fallen tree. She made a sturdy table to eat at, a simple chair to sit on, and a low platform for her sleeping bag. Her designs were not elegant or beautiful. They were simple, strong, and functional. Her hands, once skilled at designing structures that could withstand the vacuum of space, now learned the simple art of joinery, of fitting one piece of wood to another to create something useful. She also tended to her small garden. The seeds she had planted had sprouted, and now a small patch of green shoots was pushing up through the dark earth. She would spend time every day carefully pulling out the weeds, her fingers gentle as she worked around the delicate new plants. She would bring water from the lake in her bucket and give them a drink. Watching her garden grow was a source of deep and simple joy. It was a miracle to her, this process of life emerging from a tiny, dry seed. It was a kind of creation that was far more profound than anything she had ever built with starlight and meteor iron. In the afternoons, when the sun was warm, she would often stop her work and simply be. She would sit on the small, simple porch she had built at the front of the house, looking out at the lake. She would watch the way the wind created patterns on the surface of the water, a constantly shifting tapestry of ripples and waves. She would watch the slow, majestic drift of the white clouds across the vast blue canvas of the sky. She would listen to the drone of bees and the flowers she had planted. In her old life, she had never had time for this. Every moment had been filled with work, with planning, with solving problems. The concept of simply sitting and doing nothing would have been unthinkable. But here, she learned the value of stillness. She learned that there was a kind of deep nourishment to be found in quiet observation. Her mind, once a whirlwind of complex calculations and grand designs, began to grow quiet. The constant, nagging feeling of dissatisfaction, the sense of emptiness that had haunted her for so long, began to fade. It was replaced by a simple, quiet feeling of contentment. She was not building for fame or for history. She was building a life, a simple, small, and beautiful life. And it was enough. Her evenings had a rhythm of their own. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, she would finish her work for the day. She would clean her tools and put them away. She would eat her simple meal, often sitting on the porch, watching the spectacular daily performance of the sunset. The colors were even more vibrant than the sunrise, a fiery explosion of red, orange, and purple that set the sky and the water ablaze. Then, as the last of the light faded and the world settled into the deep blue of twilight, a different kind of beauty would emerge. The stars would begin to appear. At first, there would be just one or two, the brightest ones, pricking holes in the darkening sky. Then, as the darkness deepened, more and more would emerge until the sky was a glittering, shimmering blanket of a million points of light. She would often lie on her back on the grass, looking up at them. They were the same stars she had traveled among, the same stars she had used to build her magnificent creations. But here, seen from the surface of her home world, they looked different. They seemed softer, more distant, more mysterious. They were no longer a workplace or a canvas. They were a beautiful, silent mystery, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and her own small, precious place within it. And then the moon would rise. She would watch it climb above the trees, a silent, glowing orb. On clear nights, its light was so bright that it cast soft, silvery shadows on the ground. She would watch the way its light reflected on the surface of the lake. When the water was calm, the moon's reflection was a perfect, unbroken path of shimmering silver, a road of light across the darkness. When the water was choppy, the reflection would be shattered into a million glittering fragments, a dancing, sparkling field of diamonds. She would often stay out late, just watching the moon and the stars, feeling the cool night air on her skin, listening to the gentle rhythmic sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the deep resonant croaking of frogs, the lonely hoot of a distant owl. It was a time of perfect peace, a time when she felt completely and utterly at home in the universe. For many months, Faye's world was a solitary one. Her only companions were the birds and the animals of the forest. She did not speak to another person, and she was content with the silence. Her life was full, and she did not feel lonely. But one morning, she saw something that broke the familiar pattern of her world. She was on her morning walk along the shore when she saw a footprint in the soft mud that was not her own. It was larger than her own print, made by a heavy boot. She looked at it for a long time. It was a simple, ordinary thing, but it was a sign of another human presence in her quiet world. A few days later, she was sitting on her porch in the afternoon when she saw a small boat out on the lake. It was a simple, old-fashioned boat, made of wood, and a lone figure was in it, sitting perfectly still, holding a fishing rod. The figure was too far away to see clearly, but she could tell it was a man. She watched him for a long time until he eventually reeled in his line, picked up a pair of oars, and began to row toward the far side of the lake, disappearing into a small cove. She began to see the boat more regularly after that, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. The man always kept his distance, and he never seemed to look in her direction. She began to think of him as just another part of the landscape, like the deer or the hawk. He was the fisherman on the lake. One day, she was working on her garden, carefully weeding around her small flowering plants, when she heard a sound behind her. She turned, and he was there, standing at the edge of the trees, not 10 yards away. It was the fisherman. He was a tall man, though he seemed stooped a little, as if he were used to being outdoors in all weather. He looked to be around her age, perhaps a little older. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, and his hands, which he held loosely at his sides, were rough and calloused. He had kind, quiet eyes, the color of the pale green moss that grew on the stones. He was holding a fish, a beautiful, silvery creature that shimmered in the sunlight. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, then at the fish, and then he took a few slow steps forward and placed the fish on a large, flat stone that marked the corner of her garden. Then he gave her a small, shy nod, turned, and walked back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Faye looked at the fish, then at the empty space where the man had been. She was not frightened. There was a gentleness about him, a quiet respect in his manner. The fish was a gift, a simple, unspoken welcome. She cooked the fish over her fire that evening, and it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She saw him again a week later. She was trying to move a large, heavy log that had washed up on the shore, intending to use it as a bench. She was struggling with its weight, and it would barely budge. Suddenly, he was there beside her. He did not say a word. He simply took one end of the log, and together they lifted it and carried it to the spot by her front door. When they had set it down, he looked at her, and a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. She smiled back. It was the first time she had smiled at another person in a very long time. She made a gesture toward the house, an invitation. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a slow nod. She led him to her small, handmade table and poured him a cup of purified water. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, sipping their water, looking out at the lake. The silence was not awkward. It was a shared quiet, a mutual appreciation of the peace of the place. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and quiet, like the sound of the wind in the pines. "You built this place," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. She nodded. "Yes," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, rusty from disuse. "My name is Leo," he said. "I'm Faye," she replied. And that was the beginning of their friendship. Leo began to visit her regularly. He would appear silently from the woods, sometimes bringing a fish, sometimes bringing wild berries he had gathered. He was a man who knew the land. He had lived in these hills his entire life. He knew the names of all the trees and all the plants. He could read the weather in the clouds and the direction of the wind. He knew the secret paths through the forest and the best places to find mushrooms after a rain. He was a quiet man, and he did not talk much about himself. But he loved to talk about the land. He would teach her things in his quiet, gentle way. He showed her which plants were good to eat and which were poisonous. He taught her how to recognize the different bird calls. He showed her how to carve a simple, beautiful whistle from a piece of willow wood. They would spend hours together, often in comfortable silence. They would walk along the shore of the lake, or they would follow the deer trails deep into the woods. He would point out small, wonderful things she had never noticed before. The intricate pattern of a spider's web, beaded with morning dew. The bright scarlet color of a fungus growing on a decaying log. The way the light filtered through the canopy of leaves, creating a dappled, dancing pattern on the forest floor. He showed her his world, a world of small, quiet miracles. And in return, she shared her world with him. She did not tell him about the stars, about the great observatories and the libraries on Mars. That was a different life, a life that felt like a dream. She shared the world she had built here, her small stone house, her garden, her quiet rhythm. He would often watch her as she worked, a look of quiet admiration in his eyes. He would sometimes help her, his strong, capable hands making the work easier. He helped her build a small, sturdy dock that reached out into the lake, a place where they could sit in the evenings and watch the moon rise. Their love grew slowly and naturally, like a plant in her garden. It was not a fiery, passionate thing, but a slow, gentle unfolding, as quiet and as steady as the changing of the seasons. It grew in the shared silence of a walk in the woods. It grew in the simple act of him bringing her a fish for her dinner. It grew in the way they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset, without needing to speak. It grew in the way he would look at her, with a kindness and an understanding that she had never known. One evening in late summer, They were sitting on the dock, their feet dangling in the cool water. The air was warm and smelled of pine and damp earth. A full moon was rising over the lake, painting a silver path on the water. Leo turned to her. He did not say anything. He simply reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm and rough, and it fit perfectly in hers. She looked at him, and in his quiet, gentle eyes, she saw a reflection of her own feelings. In that moment, she knew that she was no longer alone in her quiet world. She had found a home, not just in the stone house she had built, but in the heart of this kind and gentle man. A year after they had first met, on a warm day in early autumn, they were married. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd of guests. It was just the two of them, standing in the small garden in front of the house. The flowers she had planted were in full bloom, a riot of orange, yellow, and blue. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. They did not exchange rings or speak formal vows. They simply stood together, holding hands, and made a quiet promise to each other, a promise to share the simple, beautiful life they had found. They were two quiet people in a quiet place, bound together by a love that was as deep and as peaceful as the lake itself. The rhythm of the earth now had a new beat, the gentle, steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one. Chapter 4. A New Life. The stone house, once a silent, empty shell, slowly began to fill with the quiet sounds of a shared life. The sharp, solitary sounds of Faye's construction were replaced by a softer, more complex harmony. Now there was the gentle, rhythmic scrape of two spoons against two wooden bowls in the morning. There was the soft thud of Leo's boots on the porch as he returned from checking his fishing lines. There was the low, gentle hum of Faye's voice as she sang to herself while tending the garden, a habit she had picked up without realizing it. And woven through it all was the sound of Leo's laughter. It was not a loud or boisterous sound. It was a quiet, warm chuckle that seemed to come from deep within his chest, a sound as comforting and as gentle as the lapping of the lake water against the shore. The house was no longer just a shelter from the rain and the wind. It had become a home, a small, warm container for their shared happiness. Their days together were a simple, repeating dance. They rose with the sun, as Faye always had, but now she would watch the dawn not alone from the window, but sitting on the porch with Leo, a warm mug of herb tea in her hands. He had taught her which leaves to gather from the forest to make the tea, and its warm, earthy taste was the taste of their life together. They would sit in a comfortable silence, their shoulders sometimes touching, and watch the world wake up. The rising sun was no longer just a beautiful, solitary experience for Faye. It was something shared, a quiet promise of another peaceful day together. After their simple breakfast, their days would be filled with the small, necessary tasks of their life. Leo would take his boat out onto the lake, his movements sure and practiced as he paddled across the still morning water. Faye would work in her garden, which was now much larger and more ambitious. Leo had helped her clear a larger patch of land, and together they had built a low stone wall around it to keep the deer out. She now grew not just flowers, but vegetables, rows of bright green lettuce, sturdy kale plants, and tall climbing beanstalks that wound their way up simple wooden poles. She found a deep and profound satisfaction in this work. To plant a tiny, hard seed and watch it grow into something that could nourish them felt like a form of magic far more real and wonderful than any technology she had ever known. She loved the feeling of the dark, cool earth on her hands, the smell of the tomato plants in the warm sun, the bright, clean snap of a bean picked fresh from the vine. Sometimes, Leo would work with her in the garden. His large, gentle hands were surprisingly deft at pulling the tiny, persistent weeds. Other times he would work with wood. He had a small, dedicated space behind the house where he would carve. He made beautiful, simple things from pieces of wood he found in the forest: smooth, polished spoons, sturdy bowls, and small, intricate figures of birds and animals. Faye would often watch him work, mesmerized by the slow, patient way he would shave away the wood, following its grain, revealing the shape that was hidden inside. It was a different kind of creation from her own. Her work had always been about imposing a design on a material, bending it to her will. Leo's work was a partnership with the wood, a gentle act of revealing its true nature. She learned from him. She learned to see the world not as a set of problems to be solved or a resource to be used, but as a living thing to be respected and understood. He taught her how to read the forest, to understand its language. He showed her how the rings on a fallen log told the story of its life, the narrow rings for the dry years, the wide rings for the years of plentiful rain. He taught her how to tell the direction from the way the moss grew on the trees. He showed her the almost invisible trails that the small forest animals used. Her world, which she had thought was just the lake and the trees, became a place of infinite complexity and wonder. They built things together. They added a small, covered porch to the front of the house, a place where they could sit in the evenings and watch the stars, sheltered from the cool night air. They built a small shed for Leo's tools and for storing firewood for the winter. Their work was a quiet, unspoken collaboration. Faye, with her innate understanding of structure and balance, would design the shape of the thing they were building. Leo, with his deep practical knowledge of wood, would know which trees to use, how to cut the joints so they would be strong, how to finish the wood so it would last for 100 years. Their skills complemented each other perfectly, and the things they built were both strong and beautiful, a reflection of their own quiet, sturdy love. Their evenings were peaceful. They would cook their dinner together over the open fire in the great stone fireplace. The smell of roasting fish or a simple vegetable stew would fill the small house with a warm, comforting aroma. After they ate, they would sit by the fire, the dancing flames casting a warm, flickering light on their faces. Sometimes they would talk, their voices low and quiet. Leo would tell her stories of his childhood, of growing up in these hills. Faye would listen, but she would never speak of her own past. The world of starships and cosmic architecture felt like a story about someone else, a person she had once known but who was now a stranger. The past was a locked room, and she had no desire to open the door. Most often, they would not talk at all. They would simply sit together, listening to the crackle of the fire and the gentle night sounds from outside. It was a comfortable, easy silence, the silence of two people who are so perfectly attuned to each other that they have no need for words. Then, one season, Faye began to feel a change within herself. It began subtly, a new kind of weariness in the mornings, a strange, metallic taste in her mouth. At first, she thought she was simply ill, but then a deeper, more profound realization began to dawn on her. She had spent her entire life creating things outside of herself, imposing her will on the physical world, building structures of light and iron and stone. Now, a new kind of creation was beginning, a process that was entirely within her, a creation that followed a blueprint she had not designed and could not control. She was pregnant. The knowledge settled into her not with a shock, but with a sense of profound and quiet awe. This was a different kind of architecture altogether, a slow, mysterious, and biological process that connected her to every living creature that had ever existed. It was the architecture of life itself. She told Leo one evening as they sat by the fire. She did not have to say many words. He looked at her, and his quiet, gentle eyes, which already held so much love, seemed to soften and deepen even more. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand on her belly, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. He did not say anything for a long time. He just looked at her, his face illuminated by the firelight, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. Her pregnancy unfolded with the changing of the seasons. It began in the late autumn, as the leaves on the trees were turning to gold and crimson, and the air grew crisp and cool. Her body began to change, her belly swelling slowly, a gentle outward curve. She felt a new kind of connection to her own body, a sense of wonder at the secret work it was doing. Leo's care for her was quiet and constant. He would make sure the fire was always burning brightly, that the house was always warm. He would bring her the most tender fish from the lake, the sweetest berries from the forest. He would take over the heavier tasks in the garden, and when they walked together, his pace would slow to match hers, his hand always ready to support her. He began to carve a new object in his workshop. He was working on a single, beautiful piece of pale birch wood. He worked on it for months, slowly and patiently, and Faye could see the shape of a cradle emerging, a small, safe boat to carry their child through the nights. Winter came, and the world was covered in a thick, soft blanket of white snow. The lake froze over, and the forest grew silent. They spent most of their time indoors, in the warm, cozy space of their small stone house. Faye felt the first fluttering movements of the baby inside her, a feeling like the gentle beat of a tiny bird's wings. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. She would sit for hours by the fire, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the secret, hidden life within her. She felt as if she were a planet, and a new moon was slowly forming in her orbit. She was no longer just Faye. She was a vessel, a home, a universe for this new being. The world outside was cold and still, but inside the small stone house and inside her own body, a new life was preparing to begin. Spring arrived with a slow, gentle melting. The ice on the lake cracked and groaned, and the first green shoots began to push their way up through the cold, damp earth. The birds returned, their songs filling the air. The world was waking up, and Faye felt as if she were waking up with it. Her body was heavy now, and her movements were slow and deliberate. The baby inside her was strong and active, and she could feel its kicks and turns, a constant reassuring presence. She and Leo would sit on the porch, watching the world turn green again, their hands often resting together on the curve of her belly. They did not talk much about the future. They did not need to. They were simply living in the moment, in the quiet, hopeful anticipation of the new life that was coming. The birth came on a warm night in early summer. The windows were open, and the sweet scent of the night-blooming flowers in her garden filled the air. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of the crickets and the soft lapping of the lake water. Leo was by her side, his presence a calm and steady anchor in the storm of her labor. His hand held hers, his quiet voice murmuring words of encouragement. The process was long and difficult, but Faye felt a strength she had never known, a deep, primal power that came from the very core of her being. And then, in the quiet, early hours of the morning, just as the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the sky, her daughter was born. She was a tiny, perfect creature with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that were the same deep, quiet blue as the lake at twilight. Leo carefully cut the cord, and he placed the warm, slippery baby on Faye's chest. Faye looked down at her daughter, at this new, separate being that had, just moments before, been a part of her. A wave of love, so powerful and so overwhelming that it was almost painful, washed over her. It was a love that made all of her past achievements, all the great and magnificent things she had built, seem small and insignificant. This was her greatest creation. This was her masterpiece. They named her Ilara. It was a name that Faye had carried in the back of her mind for years, a name that she had once seen in an old book of constellations. It meant starlight. Ilara's world, from her very first breath, was the small, peaceful world of the lake and the forest. Her first sensations were not the sterile, recycled air and the artificial light of a space station, but the warm, gentle air of a summer morning and the soft, indirect light filtering through a window. Her first smells were the smell of her mother's skin, the clean scent of the lake, the rich aroma of the damp earth after a rain, and the comforting, smoky smell of the wood fire. Her first sounds were not the hum of machinery or the synthesized voice of a computer, but the sound of her father's low, gentle voice, the sound of her mother singing a soft, simple lullaby, the songs of the birds in the morning, and the steady, rhythmic shushing of the wind in the trees. Her life was a tapestry woven from the simple, beautiful threads of the natural world. She grew up surrounded by nature. Before she could walk, she would lie on a soft blanket in the grass, her wide, curious eyes watching the dance of the leaves in the wind and the slow, majestic drift of the clouds. Her first crawl was not on a hard, synthetic floor, but on the cool, soft grass, her tiny hands pressing into the living earth. Her first steps were taken on the uneven ground of the garden, her small bare feet feeling the texture of the soil and the tickle of the blades of grass. The lake was her bathtub and her playground. Leo made her a tiny, perfect toy boat from a piece of driftwood, and she would spend hours at the water's edge, launching it on grand voyages across the shallow pools. Faye would watch her, a feeling of deep, peaceful joy filling her heart. She was giving her daughter a childhood that was the complete opposite of her own. Faye's childhood had been spent in sterile educational environments, her mind filled with complex equations and engineering principles. Ilara's childhood was spent in the dirt and the sun, her mind filled with the shapes of clouds and the names of flowers. Faye was a loving and patient mother. She taught Ilara about the simple joys of their life, not with words and lessons, but by sharing her own quiet wonder at the world. They would lie on their backs in the meadow in the summer, looking up at the sky, finding the shapes of animals in the passing clouds. "That one is a running deer," Faye would whisper, and Ilara would clap her hands in delight. "And that one is a big, sleeping bear." They would work in the garden together. Faye gave Ilara her own small patch of earth, and she taught her how to plant seeds. Ilara's first garden was a chaotic jumble of bright orange marigolds and tall, cheerful sunflowers. She would water them every day with her own tiny watering can, her face a mask of serious concentration. Faye taught her to be gentle with the living things of the world. She showed her how to hold a ladybug on her finger without hurting it, how to watch the bees on the flowers without disturbing them. They would walk in the forest, and Faye would teach her the names of the things they saw, the names Leo had taught her. "This is an oak tree," she would say, her hand on its rough bark. "And this is a fern." Ilara's vocabulary grew to include words like moss and pine cone and dragonfly. Faye's old life, the life of the famous space architect, was a carefully guarded secret. It felt like a story from a different world, a world that had nothing to do with this simple, beautiful life she had built. She did not want that old world to ever touch her daughter. She did not want Ilara to ever feel the cold, lonely ambition that had once driven her. She wanted her daughter to be rooted in the earth, not reaching for the cold, distant stars. One day, when Ilara was still very small, Faye knew she had to put her past away for good. She went to the Wanderer, the silver ship that still sat, silent and patient, in the meadow. The inside was just as she had left it, clean, sterile, and silent. It felt like a museum of a life that was no longer hers. She went to the storage compartment and opened the sealed door. Her old tools were there, the laser cutters and the nano assemblers, gleaming and perfect. Her old blueprints were there, rolled into tight tubes, their surfaces still faintly shimmering with a dusting of stardust from 100 different star systems. Her data crystals were there, containing all her designs, all her knowledge, all her fame. She gathered them all up. She found an old, sturdy wooden chest in the loft of the house, a chest that had been left there by the original builders. It was made of dark, heavy wood, bound with iron straps. It was a simple, earthly object. Carefully, one by one, she placed the artifacts of her past life into the chest. She rolled up the blueprints that showed buildings made of captured light and placed them beside a simple, hand-carved toy Leo had made for Ilara. She placed the cold, perfect tools next to a collection of beautiful, ordinary stones Ilara had gathered from the shore of the lake. She was packing away a universe. She was choosing the stones. When everything was inside, she closed the heavy lid. The click of the iron latch was a sound of finality. She and Leo carried the chest up the ladder to the small loft, and they pushed it into the darkest corner, hiding it behind a pile of old blankets and spare roofing slates. Her past was now buried, hidden away in the shadows. She was no longer Faye, the architect of quiet stars. She was just Faye, a mother, a wife, a gardener. And she was finally, completely, and utterly home. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Stars. Years passed, flowing by with the gentle, unhurried rhythm of the seasons. The world of the small stone house was a world of slow, quiet growth. The saplings that Leo had planted at the edge of the clearing grew into young, sturdy trees. The garden expanded, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to years of patient work. The stone walls of the house seemed to settle more deeply into the earth, the green moss creeping back up their sides, not as a sign of neglect, but as a soft, green embrace. Ilara grew with the seasons. She was no longer a small, toddling child. The years had stretched her limbs and filled her with a quiet, observant energy. Her dark hair, the same color as her mother's, grew long and was often filled with bits of leaves and twigs from her explorations in the forest. Her eyes, the deep blue of the twilight lake, held a steady, thoughtful gaze. She was a child of the earth, as comfortable in the woods as she was in her own bed. Her hands knew the texture of rough bark and smooth stones. Her feet knew the feel of soft moss and cool mud. Her world was small, safe, and filled with the quiet wonders of nature. Faye's love for her daughter was as vast and as quiet as the night sky. She found a joy so profound in the simple, daily acts of motherhood that it often left her breathless. She loved the feel of Ilara's small hand in her own as they walked along the shore. She loved the sound of Ilara's questions, a constant, curious stream of why and how. She loved watching the intense concentration on her daughter's face as she learned to skip a stone across the surface of the lake. This simple, earthy life was more fulfilling than any grand project she had ever completed. The hollow space inside her, the vast emptiness that had haunted her among the stars, had been completely filled by the warm, living presence of her family and her home. The past was a distant country, a place she had visited long ago and had no desire to return to. The chest in the loft remained untouched, a silent, sleeping dragon in the shadows. On clear nights, after the sun had set and the world had settled into a deep, peaceful quiet, Faye and Alara began a new ritual. Leo would often be inside by the fire, mending his fishing nets or carving a piece of wood. The comforting, rhythmic scrape of his knife, a soft sound in the background. Faye would take Alara's hand and lead her out of the warm, fire-lit house into the cool, dark air of the night. They would walk down the gentle slope of the grass to the small, sturdy dock they had built together. The air by the water was always cooler, and it carried the clean, damp smell of the lake. They would sit on the edge of the dock, their bare feet dangling just above the dark, still water. The world at night was a different place. It was a world of sounds, not sights. They would listen to the deep, resonant chorus of the frogs, the high, thin chirping of the crickets, the occasional, lonely hoot of an owl from deep in the forest. And above them, arching from one horizon to the other, was the vast, silent, shimmering expanse of the night sky. Here, in the gentle darkness, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the living earth, Faye felt safe enough to share a small, carefully edited piece of her old world with her daughter. She would point up at the sky, her finger tracing lines in the darkness. "Look," she would whisper, her voice a soft sound in the quiet. "Do you see those bright stars there? The ones that look like a spoon?" Alara would follow her mother's finger, her head tilted back, her eyes wide with wonder. "That is the Big Dipper," Faye would say. "The old stories say it is a great bear climbing across the sky." She told her daughter the simple, ancient stories that had been passed down for thousands of years, stories that had been told by people huddled around campfires, looking up at this very same sky. She showed her Orion, the great hunter with his belt of 3 bright stars. She pointed out Cassiopeia, the queen sitting on her throne. She told her the stories that were tied to the earth, to seasons, to bears, and hunters and queens. She spoke of the stars as if they were old, familiar friends in a storybook. But as she spoke these simple, earthly tales, a silent, secret battle was being fought in her mind. When she looked at Orion, she did not just see a hunter. She saw the Orion Nebula, a vast, stellar nursery where new suns were being born, a place she had once flown her ship through, its beautiful, dangerous clouds of gas glowing with impossible colors. When she looked at the faint, misty patch of the Andromeda Galaxy, she did not just see a smudge of light. She saw her greatest masterpiece, the Kepler Observatory, a silent, invisible sentinel standing its eternal watch in the void. Memories would flash in her mind, unbidden and sharp. The cold, perfect silence of a spacewalk, the breathtaking view of Saturn's rings from close up, the feeling of weightlessness, the hum of a starship's engine. These memories were like ghosts, and she would push them down, deep into the locked room of her past. She built a careful wall around her words. She never spoke of distances or light years. She never mentioned gas giants or black holes. She never, ever spoke of the buildings that she herself had hung among those distant points of light. She was giving her daughter the stars, but she was giving her the poet's stars, not the architect's. She was giving her the magic, not the mechanics. She hoped, with all her heart, that it would be enough. Ilara was a quiet and attentive listener. She would sit beside her mother, her small body perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the sky. But Faye began to notice something in the way her daughter looked at the stars. She did not seem to be seeing a bear or a hunter. Her gaze was more focused, more analytical. She had her mother's eyes that did not just see a thing for what it was, but saw the structure within it, the lines that connected it, the space that defined it. One night, Ilara pointed a small finger at the Big Dipper. "The bear is not a very good shape," she said, her voice serious and thoughtful. "The lines are too straight. A bear is round." Faye was taken aback. "It's just a story," she said gently. "But the stars," Ilara insisted, her eyes still on the sky. "They make a better shape. They make a house. See? That star is the chimney, and those three make the wall." She was not seeing a bear. She was seeing a blueprint. Faye's heart felt a strange, complicated pang, a mix of pride and a deep, unsettling fear. She saw herself in her daughter's words. She saw the mind of a builder, a shaper of things. She saw the beginning of a way of looking at the world that she recognized with a chilling familiarity. Ilara began to ask questions, but they were not the questions Faye was expecting. She did not ask if the hunter was real or if the queen was lonely. She asked about the spaces between the stars. "What is the black part?" she asked one night, her small hand sweeping across the vast, empty darkness. "It's just darkness," Faye answered, her voice a little uncertain. "It's just empty space." "No, it's not," Ilara said with the simple certainty of a child. "It's not empty. It holds the stars up. It's like the mortar between the stones on our house. It's the important part." Faye was stunned into silence. In that one simple, childish observation, Ilara had articulated the fundamental principle of celestial architecture, that the void was not an absence, but a structural element, the most important material of all. It was a concept that had taken Faye decades to fully grasp. Her daughter, who had never left the surface of this small, quiet planet, understood it instinctively. The pride Faye felt was immense, a warm, swelling feeling in her chest. Her daughter had her gift, but the fear was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She had hoped Ilara would inherit Leo's quiet, earthy wisdom. She had hoped her daughter's heart would be content with the gentle rhythms of the lake and the forest. But she was beginning to see that Ilara had inherited her own restless, star-gazing soul. The drawings began in the winter of Ilara's 7th year. The world outside was white and silent, covered in a deep layer of snow. They spent most of their time indoors, in the warm, cozy world of the stone house. One day, Ilara found a small charred stick from the fireplace. She took it to a smooth, flat stone she had brought inside from the shore. With a look of intense concentration on her face, she began to draw. At first, her drawings were of the things she knew. She drew the house, its stone walls a wobbly pattern of circles, a plume of smoke curling from the chimney. She drew Leo's boat, a simple curve on a line that was the lake. She drew the tall pine trees, their branches spiky triangles. Faye was delighted. She and Leo would look at the drawings in the evening, smiling at the simple, charming representations of their world. But then, the subject of Ilara's drawings began to change. Her gaze seemed to turn inward, or perhaps upward. She was no longer drawing the world she saw around her. She was drawing the world she saw in her mind, the world she saw in the clouds and in the stars. She began to draw strange, impossible buildings. She would sit for hours on the floor by the fire, the charred stick clutched in her small hand, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration, completely lost in her own world. She drew towers that were not built on the ground, but seemed to float in the air, their foundations resting on soft, puffy clouds. She drew bridges that were not made of wood or stone, but seemed to be woven from threads of rain, connecting one cloud to another. She drew great, spherical buildings that were half submerged in the starry sky, their lower halves hidden in the darkness, with hundreds of tiny, glowing windows that looked like stars themselves. Her drawings were full of impossible angles and graceful, sweeping curves that seemed to defy the simple, unyielding pull of gravity. They were buildings of breathtaking beauty and imagination, and they were terrifyingly familiar. One afternoon, while Alara was outside with Leo, Faye gathered up a handful of her daughter's latest drawings. She took them up the dusty ladder to the loft, the place where the past was sleeping. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She went to the dark corner and pulled away the old blankets. There was the chest, dark and silent. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the heavy iron latch. The hinges creaked, a sound of protest from a long-sealed memory. She opened the lid. The air that rose from the chest was cool and dry, and it carried a faint, metallic scent, the ghost smell of her old life. There, nestled amongst the simple, earthly treasures of her daughter's childhood, were the blueprints of her past. She carefully unrolled one. It was the plan for the whispering galleries of Saturn, a delicate, intricate web of solidified sound waves, designed to float, weightless and beautiful, within the planet's rings. The blueprint was a complex and beautiful thing, a swirl of impossibly fine lines and graceful curves, a dance of mathematics and imagination. Then she took one of Ilara's drawings, a drawing made on a flat gray stone with a piece of burnt wood. Ilara had drawn a series of delicate, interconnected rings suspended in the air, a structure that was almost identical in its form and its feeling to the galleries on the blueprint. Ilara had never seen a picture of Saturn. She did not know what a planet's rings were. And yet, she had drawn this. Faye sat there for a long time in the dusty, half-lit loft, the professional blueprint in one hand, the childish drawing in the other. The two images blurred through the tears that filled her eyes. It was not a coincidence. It was an inheritance. Her gift, the strange and wonderful way she saw the universe, had been passed on to her daughter. It was in her blood, in her bones, in the very wiring of her mind. A wave of pride, so fierce and so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. Her daughter was special. She was a creator, a dreamer, an architect of impossible things. But then, a wave of fear, cold and vast, extinguished the pride. She looked at the blueprint, at its cold, hard, technical perfection. And she remembered. She remembered the loneliness. She remembered the emptiness. She remembered the crushing weight of building magnificent empty things in a magnificent empty universe. She looked at Ilara's simple charcoal drawing. It was full of childish innocence and joyful imagination. But Faye could see where it led. She saw the path that began with this simple drawing, a path that led away from the warm, breathing earth, away from the smell of the forest and the sound of the lake. It was a path that led up into the cold, silent, beautiful, and lonely expanse of the stars. It was her path, and she had run from it. She worried. The worry was a quiet, constant presence, a shadow in the corners of her happy life. She would watch Ilara drawing, and her heart would be torn in two. She was so proud of her daughter's incredible imagination, her unique vision. She wanted to encourage it, to nurture it. She wanted to tell her, "Yes, that is a beautiful tower. But did you know you could build it from captured starlight? Did you know you could anchor it to a passing comet?" The teacher in her, the architect, longed to share her knowledge, to give her daughter the tools to make her impossible dreams real. But the mother in her was terrified. The mother wanted to protect her daughter from the ambition that had almost consumed her. She wanted to keep her safe in this small, quiet world of wood and stone and water. She wanted Ilara's feet to always be firmly planted on the ground, her hands to always be covered in the good, rich dirt of her garden. So she said nothing. She would look at Ilara's drawings of floating castles and celestial bridges, and she would say, "That is very beautiful, my love." And then she would change the subject. "Come," she would say, her voice bright and a little too cheerful. "Let's go see if the beans are ready to be picked." She would lead her daughter away from her impossible, starlit dreams and back into the simple, sun-drenched reality of the garden. Faye began to feel as if she were living two lives. On the surface, she was happy, content, her life a simple, beautiful poem. But underneath, she was fighting a constant, silent battle. She was trying to protect her daughter from a part of herself. She was trying to build a wall around Ilara's future, a wall made of the simple, earthly things she had grown to love. But she knew, with a deep and growing sense of dread, that it was a wall that would not hold. Ilara's dreams were too big for this small, quiet valley. Her daughter's eyes were not meant for looking at the ground. They were meant for looking at the stars. The legacy she had tried so hard to bury in the dark loft was not a collection of old tools and plans. It was a living thing, a way of seeing, and it was waking up in her daughter's eyes. Faye would sit on the dock at night long after Ilara was asleep. She would look up at the vast, indifferent beauty of the star-filled sky. It was no longer a source of simple wonder. It was a rival. It was a silent, glittering predator, waiting patiently to steal her daughter's heart, just as it had once stolen hers. And she did not know how to stop it. She had found her peace on earth, but she was beginning to fear that she had only been a visitor, and that her daughter was destined to continue the long, lonely journey home to the stars. Chapter 6. The Unfolding Legacy. The seasons continued their slow, graceful dance around the small stone house. The vibrant greens of summer softened into the hazy golds of late afternoon. And then, slowly, the first hints of autumn began to paint the leaves of the forest in shades of fire. The air grew crisp, and the mornings were painted with a delicate, silvery frost. Then came the rains. For a week, the world outside was a shifting, gray curtain of water. The sky was a low, heavy blanket of cloud, and the lake was a choppy, unsettled surface of dark gray. The rain pattered a constant, gentle rhythm on the slate roof, a sound that was both melancholy and deeply comforting. Inside the house, a warm, cheerful fire crackled in the great stone hearth, its light pushing back the gloom of the day, casting dancing orange shadows on the white plaster walls. The small home was an island of warmth and light in a world that had been washed clean. On the third day of the rain, a restless energy began to fill Ilara. Now 10 years old, she was a child who lived her life outdoors, her days measured by the sun and her games played among the trees and by the water. To be kept inside for so long was a kind of gentle imprisonment. She had drawn every animal she could think of on her smooth gray stones. She had helped Leo mend a tear in his fishing net, her small, nimble fingers carefully weaving the threads. She had sat by the window for hours, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. But now, she was bored, her young mind in need of a new world to explore. Faye, seeing the restless energy in her daughter, smiled. She remembered the feeling well, the need for a project, for something to discover. "Ilara," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "There are some old soft blankets in the loft, the ones we use when the winter is very cold. I saw a small tear in one of them yesterday. Would you be a dear and bring them down for me to mend?" Ilara's eyes lit up. The loft was a place of mystery. It was not forbidden, but it was a space they rarely used. It was where they stored things for the deep winter, where old tools lay sleeping, and where the summer herbs were hung to dry, their faint, dusty scent filling the air. It was a quiet, shadowy world under the eaves of the house. "Yes, Mama," she said, her boredom instantly forgotten. She scrambled up the sturdy wooden ladder that led to the small, square opening in the ceiling. Faye watched her go, a small, fond smile on her face before turning back to the sock she was darning by the fire. The air in the loft was cool and still, a world away from the warm, living space of the room below. It smelled of old, dry wood, of dust, and of the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender and mint. The only light came from a single, small, round window set into the wall at the far end of the loft, a window that looked like the porthole of a ship. On this gray, rainy day, the light it offered was weak and silvery, barely enough to see by. The space was larger than it looked from below, stretching out into the dark, shadowy corners under the slope of the roof. The floor was made of wide, rough planks, and the heavy, hand-hewn beams of the roof were just above her head. It felt like being inside the belly of a great, sleeping animal. Ilara's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. She saw the familiar things first. There were neat stacks of firewood for the coldest parts of winter. There were sacks of dried beans and preserved fruits. And there, in a neat pile, were the thick woolen blankets her mother had asked for. She walked over to the blankets and picked one up. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and camphor. But as she turned to go back to the ladder, her eyes were drawn to the darkest corner of the loft, a space almost completely hidden behind a tall stack of spare slate tiles for the roof. There was something back there, a large, dark shape that she had never noticed before. Her curiosity, a powerful force that was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes, took over. She put the blanket down and began to make her way toward the corner, her movements slow and quiet, as if she were stalking a shy forest creature. She carefully moved one of the heavy slate tiles, then another, the stone scraping softly on the wooden floor. The sound was loud in the quiet space. Behind the slates, she found it. It was a large, old wooden chest. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, almost black in the dim light, and it was bound with thick straps of rusted black iron. It did not look like anything else in their house. Everything they owned was simple, made by their own hands or by the hands of people in the town. This chest looked ancient, heavy with secrets. It looked like something from a story. A layer of thick, gray dust covered the lid. She ran her finger through it, leaving a clean, dark line. She knelt on the floor and put her hands on the lid. She tried to lift it, but it was too heavy. She grunted with the effort, her small muscles straining. It would not budge. She looked closer and saw a large iron latch on the front. It was not locked, but it was stiff with age and disuse. She put the fingers of both hands under it and pulled with all her might. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud groaning creak that echoed in the silent loft, the latch lifted. She took a deep breath and tried the lid again. This time, it moved. Slowly, heavily, she lifted the lid of the chest. It swung open with a final, deep groan and rested against the slates behind it. Elara leaned forward, her heart beating a little faster, and peered into the darkness inside. The air that rose from the chest was cool and strange. It did not smell like the rest of the loft. It smelled of something else, something metallic and cold, a scent that was clean and sterile, like the air after a lightning strike. Her eyes adjusted to the new darkness within the chest. She saw a jumble of strange objects. On top, she recognized a few of her own forgotten treasures from when she was very small. A smooth, perfectly round white stone from the lake shore, a small, carved wooden bird that her father had made for her, its wing now broken. Her mother must have saved them. But underneath these familiar things were objects that were utterly alien. She reached in and her fingers touched something cold, smooth and impossibly heavy. She pulled it out. It was a tool of some kind, made of a gleaming silvery metal she had never seen before. It had no handle, no sharp edges. It was a smooth, perfect, and silent object that seemed to hum with a quiet, contained energy in her hand. It felt impossibly foreign. She put it down carefully on the floor beside her, as if it were a sleeping snake that might wake up. Her curiosity now a burning fire, she reached into the chest again. Her fingers brushed against something that felt like paper, but it was smoother, thinner, and it had a strange, crisp coolness to it. She pulled out a long, tightly rolled tube. It was tied with a simple, faded ribbon. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with excitement. The ribbon came loose, and the tube began to unroll itself. She held it with both hands, and it spread out across the dusty floorboards. It was a large sheet of the strange, cool paper, and it was covered in a network of fine, white lines, a pattern more intricate and more beautiful than any spider's web. The lines glowed with a faint, pale light of their own in the dimness of the loft. And scattered across the surface, clinging to the paper like a dusting of fine white sugar, was a substance that shimmered and sparkled with 1,000 tiny points of light. She had never seen anything like it. She touched the shimmering dust with her finger. It felt cool and impossibly fine, and it clung to her skin, making her fingertips sparkle with a captured constellation. She did not know what it was, but she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that it was not of this world. She looked at the drawing, her eyes tracing the glowing white lines. It was a building. She knew it instantly, but it was like no building she had ever seen or imagined. It was a delicate, swirling structure of impossible grace, a series of vast, interconnected rings that seemed to float in a perfect, empty blackness. It was a shape she recognized. A shock of recognition, so powerful it made her gasp, ran through her. She had drawn this. On her flat, gray stones, with her simple, charred sticks, she had drawn this very shape, this beautiful, floating, impossible thing. She looked at the blueprint, her mind reeling. How could this be? How could this drawing from a secret hidden chest be the same as the drawing from her own mind? It was as if she were looking at a memory of something she had never seen, a dream she had forgotten she had dreamed. With the blueprint clutched in her hand, she scrambled back to the opening in the floor. She almost forgot the blankets. She went back, grabbed one, and then she made her way down the ladder, her movements clumsy, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and wonder. She emerged into the warm, fire-lit room. Faye was sitting in her chair by the fire, her head bent over her mending. Leo was at the table, sharpening his knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound a familiar, comforting part of their life. Ilara stood there for a moment, silent, the dusty blanket in one hand, the glowing, impossible blueprint in the other. Faye looked up, a gentle smile on her face. "Did you find them, my love?" she began to ask, but then she saw what was in her daughter's other hand. The smile on Faye's face froze. The color drained from her cheeks. The darning needle she was holding slipped from her fingers and fell, unnoticed, onto the wooden floor. Her breath caught in her chest. It felt as if the floor had dropped away from her, as if she were suddenly falling through a vast, empty space. It was the blueprint. It was the blueprint for the Saturn galleries. The past, which she had so carefully buried, so deeply hidden, was here, in her daughter's hand, unrolled and glowing faintly in the warm light of the fire. Leo stopped his work, his hand stilling on the knife. He looked at the strange, glowing sheet in Ilara's hand, and then he looked at his wife's pale, shocked face. He did not understand what he was seeing, but he understood instantly that something profound and irreversible had just happened. Ilara took a slow step forward. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, her wide, questioning, lake blue eyes, did all the talking. She looked from the impossible drawing in her hand to her mother's face and back again. The question in her eyes was simple and vast. What is this? And why is it inside of me? Faye looked at her daughter, at this child she had tried so desperately to root in the simple soil of the earth. And she saw in that moment that it was too late. The stars were in her daughter's eyes. The legacy she had run from had found its own way to the surface. To deny it now, to lie or to hide, would be to break the simple, honest trust that was the foundation of their life together. It would be to tell her daughter that the most wonderful, most magical part of her was something to be feared, something to be hidden. A deep, shuddering breath escaped Faye's lungs, the breath of a lifetime of secrets being released. The fight was over. The long, silent battle she had been waging was lost. And in that loss, she felt a strange, unexpected sense of relief. It was time. It was time to tell the truth. She rose slowly from her chair and knelt on the floor in front of her daughter. She gently took the blueprint from Ilara's hands and laid it on the smooth wooden floorboards. In the flickering light of the fire, its fine, white lines seemed to pulse with a gentle, living light. Leo came and sat on the floor beside them, his presence a silent, solid support. He put a warm, steadying hand on Faye's shoulder. Faye took both of Ilara's small, dust and stardust-covered hands in her own. She looked into her daughter's eyes. "I have a story to tell you," she said, her voice quiet and a little unsteady. "It's a story about a long, long time ago. It's about me, but it's also about you." And so, with the rain pattering a soft, steady rhythm on the roof and the fire crackling a warm, gentle song in the hearth, Faye began to speak. She began to unbury her past, piece by painful, beautiful piece. "Before you were born," she began, "before I met your father, before I even knew this lake existed, I lived in a very different place. I lived in a house that was like your father's boat, but much, much bigger. And it did not sail on an ocean of water. It sailed on an ocean of night, an ocean of stars. She explained what it was like to live in space, using the simple, earthly words that were now her only language. She described the silence, a quiet so deep you could hear the sound of your own heart beating. She described the feeling of weightlessness, like being a bird that never had to land, like floating forever in the deep, still water of the lake. She told Alara about her job. "I was a builder," she said, "like we built this house. But the things I built were different. I did not build with stone and wood. I built houses in the empty spaces, in the great dark quiet between the stars." She saw the look of wonder on Alara's face, and she knew her daughter understood. This was the language of her own dreams. This was the world of her own charcoal drawings. Faye picked up the blueprint from the floor. "This," she said, her finger tracing one of the glowing circular lines, "is a drawing of a place I built a long, long time ago." She told Alara about Saturn, a great, giant world, so big that the whole Earth could fit inside it 1,000 times. She described its rings, not as a scientist would, with talk of ice and rock and gravity, but as a poet would. "Imagine," she whispered, "that our lake froze over in the winter. But instead of one big sheet of ice, it was made of a million tiny, sparkling pieces of ice, each one no bigger than a grain of sand. And imagine that these pieces of ice formed a great, wide, flat road, a road that went all the way around the world, shimmering in the light of a distant sun. That is what the rings are like. And on that road of ice," she continued, "I built this. I built a house, but it had no walls and no roof. It was a place for listening. It was made of sound, a sound that was so strong it became solid, like frozen music. You could whisper a secret at one end, and it would travel all the way around the ring, a journey that would take many days, and your friend could hear it on the other side, as clear as if you were standing right next to them." She talked about the materials she had used, things that sounded like they were from a fairy tale. She described light-spun silk, a fabric made from woven moonlight that was stronger than any stone. She told of meteor iron, a metal that had journeyed through the great darkness for longer than a person could imagine, and that hummed with the memory of its long, lonely journey. She unrolled another blueprint from the chest, this one showing a tall, majestic structure carved into a great red mountain. She told Alara about Mars, a world that was cold and dry and covered in a fine red dust, a dust that was the color of the rust on the old iron latch of the chest. "There is a mountain on that world," she said, "a mountain so tall that it makes our hills look like tiny pebbles. It is a lonely, quiet mountain, and on its side, I built a library." She described the great library of Olympus Mons, not as a feat of engineering, but as a place of quiet magic. "The library was a cave," she explained, "a great quiet cave, filled with all the stories and all the knowledge of my world. But its ceiling was not rock. It was a single giant crystal, as clear and as perfect as a drop of dew on a spider's web. That world has 2 small moons, like 2 little nightlights in the sky. And at night, they would pass overhead, and their soft white light would shine down through the crystal ceiling, and it would be all the light you needed to read by. It was a place of perfect silence, where the only sound was the turning of pages that were not made of paper, but of light." As she spoke, she saw the world of her past through her daughter's eyes. She saw the wonder of it, the beauty, the magic. But she also remembered the truth, and so she told Alara the end of the story. She told her about the last masterpiece, the great, lonely observatory that looked out over the space between the galaxies. She described the feeling of finishing it, the feeling of perfect accomplishment, and the vast, crushing emptiness that had come with it. "I had built the most wonderful things," she said, her voice growing soft, her gaze turning to the fire. "But I was the loneliest person in the universe. My houses were beautiful, but they were not homes. They were cold and they were silent. And I began to dream of simple things." She looked at her daughter, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I dreamed of the smell of rain on the earth," she said. And at that moment, the sound of the rain outside seemed to grow a little louder. "I dreamed of the feeling of solid ground under my feet. I dreamed of a single warm sun in the sky. I dreamed of a home. So I left. I left all of that behind, and I came here, and I found your father, and we built this house. And then we had you, and I was not lonely anymore." Ilara listened to the whole long story, her body perfectly still, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. She did not interrupt. She just absorbed it all. And as she listened, the confused and jumbled pieces of her own inner world began to click into place. Her strange drawings of floating castles were not strange at all. They were memories, echoes from her mother's blood. The feeling she had when she looked at the stars, the feeling that she was looking at a place of structure and order and possibility, suddenly made sense. She was not just a girl who liked to draw. She was the daughter of an architect of the stars. It was not just a gift, it was an inheritance. When Faye had finished speaking, the room was silent, save for the fire and the rain. Ilara looked down at the blueprint on the floor, at its glowing, graceful lines. Then she looked up at her mother. A slow, quiet smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated understanding. She finally understood. She finally understood herself. Faye felt the last of the tension leave her body. The fear she had held for so long, the fear of what her daughter might become, melted away, replaced by a simple, profound love. She picked up the blueprint for the Saturn galleries and spread it out between them. "Come," she said gently. "Let me show you." She began to explain the plans, not as a teacher would, but as a mother would. She pointed to a complex structural notation. "This is just a number that tells you how strong the beam needs to be," she explained. "Just like your father knows how thick a piece of wood needs to be to hold up a roof." She translated the cold, hard language of science into the warm, living language of their life. She explained celestial mechanics by talking about the way a thrown stone makes an arc in the air. She explained the properties of exotic materials by comparing them to the strength of a spider's silk or the lightness of a dandelion seed. She was giving her daughter the keys to a kingdom, but she was doing it in a way that kept her daughter's feet firmly planted on the earth. She was teaching her the basics of celestial architecture, but with every word, she reminded her of the beauty of their home. "It is a wonderful thing to be able to build a dream," Faye said, her hand gently stroking her daughter's hair. "But the most wonderful dream is a place to come home to. Never forget the feel of the ground, Ilara. True peace is not out there, in the stars. It is in here." And she placed her hand gently on her daughter's heart. The legacy had been passed on, not as a burden or a destiny, but as a gift, a story, a shared secret between a mother and a daughter, told on a rainy day in the warm, safe heart of their small stone home. Chapter 7. The Long Goodbye. The years flowed through the small valley like the clear, calm water of the lake itself, each season leaving its own subtle mark. The small saplings that Leo and Faye had planted by the edge of the forest when Alara was just a child were no longer saplings. They were now tall, confident young trees, their branches reaching for the sun, their leaves adding a new, deeper layer to the rustling song of the wind. The stone house, once a fresh and new repair, had begun to weather and settle, becoming more a part of the landscape than ever before. The green moss, which Faye had once diligently scraped away, had been allowed to return, creeping back up the cool, north-facing stones in a soft, velvety blanket. The wooden porch they had built had weathered to a beautiful, silvery gray, its surface worn smooth by the passage of countless footsteps. The garden had become a lush, established tapestry of life, the soil dark and rich from years of care, the bean poles and tomato cages standing like familiar old friends waiting for the warmth of summer. Alara was no longer a child. The passage of time had transformed her from a small, curious girl into a tall, thoughtful teenager. She now stood almost as tall as her mother, her long, dark hair still perpetually filled with the wildness of the forest. The wide, wondering eyes of her childhood had settled into a gaze that was calm, steady, and deeply intelligent. She moved with a quiet, natural grace, as at home in the dense woods or on the shimmering water as any of the wild creatures who shared their valley. She knew the forest as intimately as she knew the lines on her own hand. She could identify a bird, not just by its song, but by the flash of its wing in the dense canopy of leaves. She knew which mushrooms were safe to eat after a rain, where the wild strawberries grew thickest in the early summer, and how to follow the almost invisible trails of the deer to their hidden drinking spots. She had her father's deep, earthy wisdom, his quiet understanding of the natural world. But in her eyes, when she looked up at the night sky, there was still the unmistakable, far-seeing gaze of her mother, the look of a builder, a dreamer, a gazer into the vast, beautiful emptiness between the stars. Leo's hair was now more gray than brown, and fine, deep lines crinkled at the corners of his kind eyes, lines etched there by years of smiling and squinting into the sun. He moved a little more slowly now, his shoulders a little more stooped, but his hands were as strong and as capable as ever. His love for Faye and Alara was a quiet, constant presence, as steady and as reliable as the rising of the sun, a warm, solid foundation upon which their peaceful life was built. Faye herself had aged with a quiet grace. Her hair, once as dark as Alara's, was now a soft, beautiful silver, and her face was a lovely map of her life, each line a record of laughter, of worry, of quiet contentment. She still moved with the purpose of a builder, but her steps were slower now, more deliberate. The fierce, restless energy that had once driven her to conquer the stars had long since been transformed into a deep, abiding peace, a quiet joy in the simple, repeating rhythms of her earthly home. The years had been kind, a long, gentle, sun-drenched afternoon. But even the longest and most beautiful afternoon must eventually fade into the soft, quiet twilight. The change began so slowly that at first, no one, not even Faye, truly noticed it. It began as a new kind of tiredness, a weariness that settled deep into her bones, a feeling that a long night's sleep could no longer completely wash away. She would find herself pausing for a moment longer than usual as she worked in the garden, leaning on her spade, her breath coming a little faster than it should. She would dismiss it as the simple, natural process of getting older. She had lived a full life, 2 full lives in fact, and it was only natural that her body would begin to slow down. But the tiredness did not go away. It grew, a slow, creeping tide, stealing a little more of her energy each week. It was followed by a subtle, persistent ache in her joints, a stiffness in the mornings that made the simple act of getting out of bed a slow, careful process. She started to feel the cold more deeply in the winter, the damp chill of the valley seeping into her in a way it never had before. She kept it to herself for a long time, not wanting to worry Leo or Ilara. She would push through the weariness, her quiet strength and determination still a powerful force within her. But they noticed. Leo, with his deep, quiet attentiveness, saw the subtle changes. He saw the way she would pause for a breath halfway up the gentle slope from the lake. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her morning cup of tea. He saw the new, faint shadows under her eyes that had not been there before. He did not say anything, but he began to quietly change their life. He would wake a little earlier to bring in the firewood, so she would not have to. He took over the heavier work in the garden, turning the soil and carrying the buckets of water, telling her that his back was feeling strong and he enjoyed the work. He began to cook their evening meals more often, his large, gentle hands surprisingly skilled at preparing the simple, nourishing stews they both loved. His love for her was expressed not in worried words, but in these countless, small, silent acts of care. Ilara noticed too. She had her mother's sharp, observant eyes. She saw the new slowness in her mother's steps, the way she would sometimes sit in her chair by the fire, her mending lying forgotten in her lap, her gaze lost in the dancing flames, a look of profound weariness on her face. A quiet, protective instinct awoke in the young girl. She began to stay closer to the house, her long explorations of the forest growing shorter. She would seek out her mother, finding small ways to help. She would offer to fetch the water from the lake, to weed the flower beds, to brush her mother's long silver hair in the evenings by the fire. A subtle, unspoken shift occurred in the small family. Faye, the creator, the builder, the strong one, was slowly, gently, becoming the one who was cared for. And Leo and Ilara, without a word ever being spoken, stepped into their new roles, their love for her a silent, unwavering shield against the slow, encroaching shadows. One day in the spring, as Faye was planting a new row of seeds in the garden, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, and the bright green of the new leaves blurred into a meaningless swirl. She dropped her trowel and put a hand on the low stone wall to steady herself. The feeling passed, but it left a cold, undeniable certainty in its wake. This was not just the tiredness of age. This was something more. This was a sickness, a slow, patient illness that was taking root inside of her. A quiet, methodical dismantling of the house of her own body. She was an architect. She understood structures. She understood how they were built, and she understood how they failed. And she knew, with a calm, clear-eyed certainty that was devoid of fear or panic, that her own structure was beginning to fail. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the last of the pink light fade from the sky, she told them. She spoke in her usual, simple, direct way. There were no tears, no drama. She simply told them what she knew to be true. "My body is tired," she said, her voice as calm as the surface of the lake at twilight. I think it is getting ready for a long rest." Leo took her hand, his grip warm and strong. Ilara moved from her seat on the steps and knelt on the porch in front of her mother, resting her head in her mother's lap. No one said anything for a long time. There was nothing to say. They simply sat together in the gathering darkness, a small, silent triangle of love, and accepted the truth of what was to come. The world of Faye's life began to gently shrink. Her long walks through the forest became short, slow strolls to the edge of the trees. Then they became a single, daily walk down to the dock, her arm linked through Leo's, each step a deliberate and conscious effort. Then the walk to the dock became too much. Her world shrank to the small stone house and the porch. She would spend her days wrapped in a soft woolen blanket, sitting in a comfortable chair that Leo had positioned in the sunniest corner of the porch. From here, she could still see her world. She could see the garden, now tended entirely by Alara, who worked with a fierce, loving diligence. She could watch Leo in his boat on the lake, a small, familiar figure on the vast blue water. She could watch the birds at the feeder they had hung from a branch of the nearby birch tree. It was a small world, but it was a beautiful one, and it was enough. As the summer faded into autumn and the air grew cool, even the porch became too far. Her world shrank again to the single, warm room of the house. Leo and Alara moved her bed from the small sleeping alcove and placed it by the large window that looked out over the lake. This window became her world. It was a living painting, a constantly changing masterpiece that brought her a deep and abiding peace. This became her final project, to observe with the same focused attention she had once given to the stars, the simple, profound beauty of her home. She would watch for hours, her mind quiet, her heart at peace. She watched the way the morning mist rose from the water, a slow, silent lifting of a ghostly veil. She watched the sun climb the sky, its light changing the color of the water from a deep, mysterious blue to a bright, sparkling silver. She watched the wind draw its invisible patterns on the surface of the lake, creating dark, rippling patches and long, smooth, glassy streaks. She watched the rain come, the first fat drops creating small, concentric circles on the water, until the whole surface was a dancing, stippled pattern of a million tiny impacts. She watched the storms roll in from the west, the sky turning a dramatic bruised purple, the lightning flashing in the distance, a silent, beautiful display of nature's power. She watched the slow, majestic drift of the autumn leaves as they fell from the trees and skated across the surface of the water like tiny, colorful boats. She watched the birds, the herons standing like patient, gray statues in the shallows, the ducks leaving their perfect V-shaped wakes as they swam by. In her stillness, her other senses grew sharper. She could hear the world with a new clarity. She could hear the soft, almost inaudible whisper of the first snowflakes touching the glass of the window. She could hear the tiny, scratching sounds of a mouse in the walls of the old house. She could distinguish the different sounds of the wind, the low, mournful sigh as it moved through the bare branches of the deciduous trees, and the higher, more constant shushing sound as it passed through the needles of the tall pines. Her sense of smell was filled with the sense of her home. The rich, earthy smell of the stew Leo was cooking on the fire. The clean, fresh scent of the sheets that Alara had hung outside to dry in the crisp autumn air. And always the faint, underlying scent of wood smoke, the constant, comforting perfume of their life together. She was not afraid. The fear that had once haunted her, the fear of emptiness, of loneliness, was gone. She had filled her life so completely with simple, real things that there was no room left for fear. She looked at her own slow, gentle fading not as a tragedy, but as a natural and necessary part of a beautiful process. She was an architect. She understood that all structures, from the grandest star to the smallest flower, have a lifespan. They are built, they stand for a time in the sun, and then they slowly, gracefully return to the elements from which they came. She had built her first life out of ambition and a desire for permanence, creating monuments that would last for eons. But she had found true peace in her second life, a life built of things that were beautiful precisely because they were not permanent. The warmth of a fire, the taste of a fresh-picked berry, the fleeting beauty of a sunset, the love of her family. She had looked for peace across the entire universe, in the silent spaces between the galaxies, only to find it here, in this small, simple room, in the sound of her husband's quiet footsteps and her daughter's gentle voice. The days grew shorter. The winter came, deep and quiet. The lake froze over, a vast, unbroken sheet of white. The world outside her window became a simple, beautiful drawing in black and white, the dark shapes of the bare trees against the white snow. She grew weaker. Her breath became a shallow, gentle rhythm. She slept more and more, her dreams a soft, pleasant jumble of her two lives. She dreamed of floating in the warm, sunlit water of the lake, and she dreamed of floating in the silent, star-dusted void. In her dreams, the two places were no longer separate. They were one and the same, a place of perfect, peaceful suspension. Leo and Alara were with her always. They took turns sitting by her bed, a constant, loving vigil. They would read to her from simple books of poetry. Leo would tell her about his day, about the tracks he saw in the snow, about the way the ice was forming on the lake. Alara would sit and hold her hand, sometimes for hours, the warmth of her young, living hand a comforting anchor. One afternoon, Faye woke from a long sleep. The light in the room was soft and golden, the light of a late winter afternoon when the sun is low in the sky. Alara was sitting in the chair by her bed, her hands busy mending one of her father's shirts, her head bent in concentration. Faye watched her for a long time. She saw in her daughter's face a beautiful blend of her own focused intensity and Leo's quiet, gentle spirit. She saw a young woman who was strong and capable, a woman who was deeply rooted in the earth, but whose eyes still held the light of the stars. She knew, with a mother's deep and certain instinct, that Alara would be all right. "Alara," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, a dry, rustling sound like leaves skittering across the ground. Ilara's head shot up. She put down her sewing and moved to the edge of the bed, taking her mother's thin, cool hand in her own. "I'm here, Mama," she said softly. Faye looked into her daughter's eyes. It was time for her final lesson. It was time to give her daughter the map that would allow her to navigate the wonderful, dangerous world of her own dreams. "You have such a gift, my love," Faye whispered. "I see it in your drawings. I see it in your eyes. You see the bones of the world. You see how things fit together. It is a wonderful, beautiful gift. Do not ever be afraid of it." Alara just nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "You will want to build things," Faye continued, her voice gaining a little strength from the importance of her words. "You will see shapes in the clouds and in the stars, and you will have a fire inside you that will not let you rest until you have made them real. That fire is a good thing. You must follow it. You must follow your dreams, Alara, wherever they lead you, even if they lead you far away from here, far away from this lake." She squeezed her daughter's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "But you must promise me something." "Anything, Mama," Alara whispered, the tears now tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "You must never forget this place," Faye said, her eyes moving to the window, to the view of the frozen lake and the snow-covered trees. "You must never forget the feeling of the solid ground under your feet. You must never forget the sound of the wind in the trees or the smell of the earth after it rains. Your dreams may take you to the stars, and that is a beautiful thing. But the stars are cold, my love. They are beautiful, but they are cold and they are lonely. There is no warmth there. The warmth is here." She brought her gaze back to her daughter's face. "The things you build, no matter how grand or how beautiful, will never fill the empty spaces inside you. I tried. I built wonders, Alara, wonders you cannot even imagine. And my heart was as empty as the space between the galaxies. True peace, the peace that you are looking for, the peace that all builders are looking for, it is not out there." She lifted her other hand, a slow, weak gesture, and placed it gently on Alara's chest, over her heart. "It is in here. It is made of simple things, of love, of kindness, of knowing where your home is. Build your beautiful dreams, my starlight. Build them for the joy of building them. But build your life here, in your own heart. That is the only masterpiece that will ever truly matter." She was tired now. The effort of speaking had taken the last of her strength. She sank back into the pillows, her eyes closing. Alara sat with her, holding her hand, her mother's words settling deep into her soul. She understood. She finally, completely understood the truth of her mother's journey and the truth of the path that lay ahead of her. Leo came in as the sun was setting, painting the snow outside the window in soft shades of pink and orange. He sat on the other side of the bed, and they sat together, the three of them, as the light faded from the world and the first, pale stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Faye did not wake again. She slipped away peacefully in the deep, quiet hours of the night. Her passing was not a struggle. It was a gentle release, a final, quiet sigh. Her last breath mingled with the cool night air that was coming through the slightly open window. Leo and Alara were with her, holding her hands. They did not weep. The time for tears would come later. In that moment, there was only a profound and holy stillness. The room was filled with a deep, quiet peace. Faye was gone. The architect had left her final, most perfect structure. Outside the window, the moon cast a bright, silvery light on the frozen, sleeping lake. The only sound in the world was the faint, almost inaudible whisper of the night wind, a sound like a gentle, eternal breath. It was the sound of the earth, the sound of her home, the sound of her peace, and it was the last sound she ever heard. Chapter 8. The Architect of Earth and Sky. After Faye was gone, a new kind of silence settled over the small stone house. It was not the peaceful, comfortable silence of their shared life, but a hollow, aching quiet that was heavy with the weight of her absence. The house, which had been a warm, living heart, now felt like an empty shell. Every familiar object seemed to cry out with a memory of her. Her empty chair by the fire stood like a silent, lonely sentinel. Her gardening tools, leaning against the outside wall, seemed to be waiting for a touch that would never come again. The simple wooden cup she drank her morning tea from sat on its shelf, a small, heartbreaking monument to a life that had ended. The silence was in the rooms, in the spaces between the familiar sounds. The rhythmic scrape of Leo's carving knife no longer had the soft counterpoint of Faye's humming. The cheerful bubble of the stew pot on the fire was no longer accompanied by the gentle clink of her darning needle against a thimble. The world had lost a layer of its sound, and the quiet that remained was thin and cold. Grief was a physical presence for Leo and Alara, a constant, invisible companion. For Leo, it was a heavy weight on his shoulders, a slowness in his limbs. He moved through his days with the same steady purpose, mending his nets, checking his lines, chopping the wood. But the quiet joy that had always been in his movements was gone. His face, usually so calm and open, seemed to have closed in on itself, his kind eyes clouded with a deep, private sorrow. He would often stop his work and just stand, his gaze lost on the far shore of the lake, his mind clearly in a place that no one else could reach. He was a man who had found his entire world in this small valley, and the center of that world had vanished. For Alara, grief was a sharp, biting wind that seemed to blow right through her. It was a constant ache in her chest, a feeling that the world was suddenly out of focus, its colors muted, its edges blurred. She would wake in the mornings, and for a single blissful moment, she would forget. Then the memory would rush in, and the emptiness of the house would hit her like a physical blow. The simple routines of their life, once a source of comfort, were now a series of painful reminders. Setting the table for 2 instead of 3. Looking up from her book to share a thought, only to find her mother's chair empty. Walking along the lakeshore and seeing only one set of smaller footprints beside her father's large ones. She felt adrift, a small boat that had lost its anchor, and the familiar, beloved landscape of her home now seemed vast, empty, and a little frightening. They cared for each other in their quiet, unspoken way. Leo would make sure Alara ate, placing a bowl of warm stew in front of her, his large hand resting on her shoulder for a moment, a gesture of silent, solid love. Alara would make sure the fire never went out, adding logs throughout the day, a small, fierce battle against the coldness that had crept into their home. They did not talk about their sadness. They did not have the words. Instead, they moved around their shared grief, giving it space, respecting its power, and finding a small, fragile comfort in the simple, continuing rhythm of their days. After the first few weeks of numb, hollow shock had passed, Alara found herself being pulled, as if by an invisible thread, toward the loft. The source of her comfort, she knew, was in the place where her mother's secrets had been kept. One gray, quiet afternoon, she climbed the ladder into the dusty, silent space under the roof. The air was cool and still, and it smelled of old wood and her mother's dried herbs. She made her way to the dark corner and lifted the heavy lid of the old wooden chest. There they were, her mother's past, her own future. She did not touch the strange, silent tools. It was the blueprints that called to her. She took them out, one by one, her hands gentle and reverent, and she carried the heavy rolled tubes down the ladder. In the main room, with the gray afternoon light filtering through the window, she unrolled them on the smooth, clean floorboards. The floor was suddenly covered in a series of impossible glowing maps. The fine, white lines, still faintly shimmering with a dusting of stardust, seemed to pulse with a quiet, inner light. They were so much more than just drawings. They were her mother's thoughts, her mother's dreams made visible. They were the last, most intimate part of Faye that she had left to give. She spent the rest of that day, and many days after, on the floor, surrounded by these ghosts of a life she had never known. She did not study them like an architect, analyzing their structural integrity or their mathematical precision. She studied them like a daughter, searching for the heart of the woman who had created them. She looked at the swirling, delicate lines of the Saturn galleries and saw not just a feat of engineering, but a sense of playfulness, of joy in the creation of something impossibly beautiful and slightly frivolous. She imagined her mother, a younger woman, dreaming of a place made of frozen music. She looked at the strong, clean, majestic lines of the library on Mars and saw a deep love of knowledge, a reverence for silence and for learning. She could almost feel the peace of that great, crystal-ceilinged room, could almost see the soft, twin moonlight filtering down onto the silent data crystals. She looked at the blueprints for the observatories that danced in the fire of blue giants, and she saw a fearless curiosity, a brave, unblinking desire to look into the very heart of creation. And then she would unroll the final blueprint, the one for the Kepler Intergalactic Observatory. It was the largest and most complex of them all, a design of such breathtaking scale and perfect cold symmetry that it made her own heart ache. In its perfect, diamond-like form, suspended in the vast, perfect emptiness between the galaxies, she saw the culmination of her mother's gift. But she also saw the end of her mother's journey. She saw the loneliness. She saw the cold, hard perfection that had no room for a beating heart. She finally understood, not just with her mind, but with her soul, why her mother had left it all behind. She had not been running away from building. She had been running toward a different kind of building. She had been searching for a material that was not on any of her blueprints, the simple, messy, imperfect, and absolutely essential material of love. Alara began to draw. She brought down her own collection of flat, gray stones from the loft and her box of charred drawing sticks. She would lay one of her mother's blueprints on one side of the fireplace, and she would place her own drawing stone on the other. She did not try to copy her mother's designs. That was not the point. Instead, she began a quiet conversation. She would look at the floating, weightless grace of her mother's celestial architecture, and then she would look out the window at the solid, rooted strength of the old oak tree that grew by the shore. She would look at the shimmering, artificial beauty of a structure made of light-spun silk, and then she would look at the simple, honest beauty of a stone her father had pulled from the lake, its surface worn smooth by 1,000 years of water. Her own drawings began to change. They were no longer just the fantastical, untethered dreams of her childhood. A new element began to appear in her floating castles and celestial bridges. They began to have roots. They began to touch the ground. She drew towers that grew out of the earth like trees, their lower portions made of rough stone and gnarled wood, their upper reaches branching out into the sky in delicate, crystalline forms. She drew bridges that were anchored to the solid rock of a mountainside, but that soared across the sky in an arc of pure, captured light. She was no longer just her mother's daughter. She was her father's daughter, too. In her drawings, the earth and the sky were no longer two separate places. They were beginning to become one. The long, quiet winter passed in this way, a slow, gentle season of grieving and of learning. The sharp edges of her sadness began to soften. The memory of her mother was no longer just a source of pain, but a source of quiet strength and inspiration. The house began to feel less empty. It was filled with the silent, powerful presence of her mother's work and her own emerging vision. One evening in the very early spring, just as the ice on the lake was beginning to groan and crack, a signal that the world was preparing to wake up, Alara made a decision. It came to her not as a sudden thought, but as a quiet, calm certainty that settled into her heart. She knew what she had to do. She knew what her first project would be. She would build something for her mother. Not a sad, heavy gravestone, but a place of beauty and of memory. A place that would honor both of the lives her mother had lived. A place that would connect the earth she had come to love with the stars she had never forgotten. She took a clean, smooth gray stone and began to draw. For days, she drew and erased and drew again, her mind focused and clear. The design that emerged was simple, quiet, and beautiful. It would be a small, circular structure, like a tiny open-air room, built on the small point of land that jutted out into the lake, the very place where she and her mother had so often sat to watch the stars. The foundation and the low surrounding wall would be built of the same dark, rounded stones that their house was made of, stones from the shore of the lake itself. The floor would be a single, large, flat slab of slate from the old quarry in the hills, and in the very center of the floor she would place a single, upright pillar, not of stone, but of thick, clear glass. The top of the pillar would be cut at a very specific and precise angle, an angle she calculated with a simple piece of string and a protractor she made from a piece of wood. The angle was designed to catch the light of a single specific star, Polaris, the North Star, the most constant and steady light in the northern sky. At night, the light from that one star would travel down through the glass pillar, and it would cast a small, soft, steady point of light on a particular mark on the stone floor. It would be a building that did nothing. It would not provide shelter. It would not perform a function. Its only purpose was to be a quiet, beautiful connection between the ground and a single, distant star. It was an observatory for the heart. She showed the drawing to her father. He sat at the table, the gray stone in his large, calloused hands, and he studied it for a long time. He looked at the simple, strong circle of the stone wall. He looked at the idea of the glass pillar. He looked at the small, intricate calculations she had made to find the angle of the light. He did not completely understand the science of it, the way she had tracked the star, the way the light would bend through the glass. But he understood the poetry of it. He understood the love that was in the design. He looked up at his daughter, and for the first time since Faye had died, he smiled. It was a true smile, a smile that reached his kind, sad eyes. "Your mother would have loved this," he said, his voice a little thick with emotion. "Let's build it together." And so began the slow, healing work of construction. It was a project that they undertook with a quiet, shared purpose. It was their way of grieving together, their way of honoring the woman they had both loved so dearly. They started with the foundation. They took Leo's boat and paddled along the shore, searching for the right stones. They did not just take any stone. They chose each one with care. They looked for stones that were smooth and rounded by the water, stones that were a deep, dark gray, the color of the lake on a stormy day. They would wade into the cold, shallow water of the early spring, and they would lift the heavy stones, their muscles straining, and they would carefully place them in the boat. It was hard, cold, physical work, but it was good work. With each stone they lifted, it felt as if they were lifting a piece of their own heavy sadness, giving it a place and a purpose. They laid the circular foundation, and then they began to build the low wall, a wall that was only as high as their waists. Ilara had learned the art of stonemasonry from her mother, from watching her rebuild the wall of their own house. She knew how to mix the mortar, how to choose the right stone to fit into each space, how to tap it into place so that it was solid and secure. She and Leo worked in a comfortable, easy silence. He would mix the mortar, his strong arms turning the thick, heavy paste. He would lift the heaviest stones into place for her. She, with her architect's eye and her nimble fingers, would be the one to do the fine, detailed work of fitting them together. The wall rose slowly, a beautiful, imperfect circle of dark stone, a piece of the shoreline that had been lifted up and given a new shape. While the mortar cured, they went into the hills to the old, abandoned quarry to find the stone for the floor. They found a large, perfect slab of dark gray slate, thick and flat, its surface etched with the faint, delicate patterns of ancient, fossilized ferns. It was too heavy to carry. Leo, using his deep knowledge of the land, devised a simple, clever system of levers and rollers, using logs from the forest. Slowly, painstakingly, over the course of 2 days, they moved the massive stone out of the quarry and down the gentle slope of the hill to the shore of the lake. They floated it back to their small point of land on a raft that Leo built from old logs. The final placement of the floor was the hardest part of all, but they did it, their movements a slow, careful dance of shared effort and understanding. The slate floor, when it was finally in place, was perfect. It was a smooth, dark circle within the rougher circle of the wall, a quiet, contemplative space. The final piece was the most difficult. Ilara needed a pillar of clear, solid glass, a material that could not be found in their simple, natural world. For this, she knew she had to leave. She had to go back to the world her mother had left behind. She went to the Wanderer, the silent, silver ship that still sat in the meadow, a forgotten piece of the sky. She had never been inside it before. The airlock hissed open, and she stepped into a world that was utterly alien. The air was sterile, the light was artificial, and the silence was absolute. It was the world of her mother's first life, and for the first time, she could feel the profound loneliness that had driven her mother home. She found what she was looking for in the ship's small, onboard fabrication unit. Following her mother's simple, written instructions, which she had found in a data crystal in the chest, she programmed the machine to create a single solid cylinder of pure, flawless glass, cut to the precise dimensions and the exact angle of her design. She watched, mesmerized, as the machine hummed to life and the pillar slowly took shape in a bath of pure, white light. It was a piece of starlight, made solid. She and Leo carried the heavy glass pillar to the memorial and, with the utmost care, they set it in the exact center of the slate floor. It stood there, a column of pure, captured light, connecting the dark, solid earth of the floor to the vast, open sky above. The memorial was complete. They finished it on a clear, cool evening in the late summer, the anniversary of the day Faye and Leo had been married in the garden. They stood together inside the low, circular wall, their work done. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, velvet blue, just beginning to fill with the first, faint stars. Ilara looked at what they had built. It was a simple, quiet place, but it felt powerful. It felt sacred. It was a perfect balance of her father's world and her mother's. The stones were the earth. The glass was the sky. It was a place where the two could meet. As the sky grew darker, the stars grew brighter. Ilara watched as Polaris, the North Star, climbed higher. She waited, her heart beating with a quiet anticipation. And then, it happened. The faint, ancient light of the distant star, having traveled for centuries across the unimaginable emptiness of space, entered the top of the glass pillar. It bent just as she had calculated, and it traveled down the length of the glass. And on the dark slate floor, at the base of the pillar, a small, soft, steady point of light appeared, a tiny captured star, a whisper from the cosmos brought down to earth. Leo gasped softly. It was a quiet, simple, and profound magic. Ilara looked at the tiny star on the floor, and then she looked up at the real star in the sky. And in that moment, she understood her mother's journey completely. Faye had not given up her dreams. She had not failed. She had simply found a new, quieter one. She had not chosen the earth over the sky. She had found a way to hold them both. Her mother's final masterpiece was not the great cold observatory between the galaxies. It was this life. It was this love. It was this small, peaceful home by the lake. Ilara looked at the stars, the same stars her mother had once built among. They no longer seemed like a rival, a cold, distant place that would pull her away. They were just a beautiful, silent part of her world, just like the lake and the trees and the wind. Her heart was full, not with sadness, but with her mother's love and with the quiet, steady hum of her own new dreams. She would build amazing things one day. She knew that. The fire was in her, but she would never be lost. She would never be lonely. Her feet were here, on the solid ground of her home. Her hand was in her father's, and her heart was at peace. The legacy was not just continuing. It had been transformed. It was rooted. It was home.